For most people alive today, hunger moves slowly. A missed meal, an empty afternoon, perhaps a day of fasting by choice. But for most humans who ever lived, hunger could arrive without warning. A herd might suddenly change its path. A storm could destroy the plants people depended on. A season might become colder or drier than expected. For hundreds of thousands of years, food was never fully secure, and survival depended on systems that could fail overnight. The world that shaped the human body was not stable, predictable, or generous. It was fragile, and if food could disappear so quickly for most of our past, what kind of life did our ancestors actually live? And why could 90% of human history starve suddenly? For most of human history, the search for food did not begin at a fixed place. There were no fields to return to, no barns, no stored harvest waiting behind wooden doors. Food existed somewhere in the landscape, but rarely in the same place for long. The earliest humans lived inside ecosystems that were constantly shifting, and their survival depended on following these movements rather than controlling them. A valley that offered edible plants in one season might be empty the next. A river rich with fish during one year might run thin during another. In this world, hunger was not only the absence of food, it was the uncertainty surrounding where food might appear next. Archaeological evidence and studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest that for most of the time humans have existed as a species, food came from many small sources scattered across the environment rather than from a single stable supply. Wild fruits, roots, insects, shellfish, small animals, and occasionally large game formed a shifting mosaic of opportunities. Each required time, skill, and luck. None could be guaranteed. The landscape itself determined what was possible on any given day. A sudden change in weather could alter the behavior of animals or damage the plants people depended on. When this happened, the entire rhythm of survival had to adjust. Early humans did not live in a world organized around predictable meals. Instead, they moved through environments where energy entered human life in irregular pulses. One day might bring an abundance of food after a successful hunt or a patch of ripe plants. Another day might offer very little. Over long stretches of time, these fluctuations were part of the natural pattern of life. This pattern was shaped long before the appearance of villages or agriculture. Our species emerged within ecosystems where humans were only one participant among many. Other animals competed for the same plants. Seasonal migrations altered the presence of prey. Even subtle environmental shifts could transform which foods were available. Because of this, human groups often relied on a wide range of foods rather than depending on a single resource. Diversity reduced risk, but it did not remove it. Each individual food source could disappear without warning. If a group relied heavily on a herd of animals that suddenly moved away, the loss could be immediate. If a stretch of coastline stopped producing shellfish after a storm, people had to search elsewhere. The archaeological record contains many signs that early humans regularly shifted their camps and travel routes. These movements were not random. They reflected knowledge accumulated over generations about where food might appear during different times of the year. Yet even this knowledge could not eliminate uncertainty. Landscapes change, climate fluctuates, animal populations rise and fall. What worked reliably in one generation could fail in the next. In such a setting, food security was rarely permanent. It existed only temporarily, in places and seasons where resources happened to align with human needs. The rest of the time, survival depended on attention, memory, and movement across the land. The human story began in environments where the distance between abundance and scarcity could be surprisingly small. A place that seemed generous could become empty in a matter of days if animals moved on or plants finished their short growing cycle. This fragile balance shaped the daily awareness of early humans. Every landscape carried both opportunity and risk. The same forest that offered edible roots and fruits also contained long periods when those foods were not available. Over many thousands of generations, the human body and mind adapted to this unstable relationship with food. The expectation of constant abundance never had time to develop. Instead, our species learned to exist within a world where nourishment appeared, disappeared, and returned again, according to patterns that humans could observe but never fully control. When people today imagine food, they often imagine a place where it waits. A field of crops, a kitchen shelf, a marketplace, a refrigerator. These places create the feeling that food belongs somewhere and can be returned to whenever it is needed. For most of human history, this idea would have made little sense. Food did not wait. It appeared only briefly in certain places and then disappeared again. Early humans moved through landscapes where nourishment existed in moments rather than in permanent stores. Understanding this difference is important because it reveals how fragile the human relationship with food once was. Many of the foods that supported ancient human groups existed only during narrow windows of time. Wild fruits ripen quickly and then fall or spoil. Edible leaves grow during short seasonal periods. Underground roots may be present year-round, but they require knowledge and labor to locate. Even animals move according to patterns that change with weather, water, and vegetation. In this kind of world, survival depended less on ownership and more on timing. A group arriving at a location too early or too late might find nothing at all. Archaeological studies of ancient campsites suggest that many groups returned repeatedly to certain landscapes, but not because those places always contained food. Instead, these locations offered resources only during specific seasons. A riverbank might be valuable during fish migrations. A hillside might provide edible seeds during a short harvest window. A coastal area might offer shellfish during particular tides. Outside of these moments, the same places could be nearly empty of food. This meant that human movement was deeply tied to cycles in the natural world. People followed patterns that were learned slowly over generations. Knowledge about where plants grew, when animals migrated, or which shorelines produced shellfish became essential cultural memory. Yet, even with this knowledge, the system remained uncertain. A change in rainfall could delay plant growth. A colder season might reduce animal populations. Flooding could reshape river channels and remove familiar fishing grounds. Because of this, human survival required constant observation. The landscape had to be read carefully, almost like a living calendar. Small signals mattered. The flowering of certain plants might indicate that edible fruits would soon appear nearby. The movement of birds might signal the presence of fish or insects. The condition of animal tracks could reveal how recently a herd had passed through an area. These details help people anticipate where food might be found, but they could never remove the underlying instability. One important difference between ancient food systems and modern ones lies in scale. Today, food production often concentrates large amounts of calories in one place. A farm field, for example, may produce thousands of kilograms of grain from a small area. In contrast, wild ecosystems spread edible energy thinly across wide landscapes. Finding enough food required moving across these spaces and collecting many small resources. This scattered structure made sudden scarcity more likely. If several food sources failed at the same time, there was no large reserve to replace them. Anthropologists studying recent hunter-gatherer societies have observed similar patterns. Food often arrives in bursts of abundance followed by quieter periods. A successful hunt might provide large amounts of meat for a short time, but that supply cannot last indefinitely without preservation. A productive plant harvest may feed a group well for a few days before those plants are exhausted. The rhythm of life therefore becomes uneven, alternating between moments of plenty and moments of careful rationing. This uneven rhythm shaped the expectations of early humans. Rather than assuming that food would appear each day in the same place, people learned to expect variation. A good day did not guarantee another good day. Abundance did not remove the possibility of scarcity nearby in time. Over many generations, human communities developed flexible strategies to cope with this uncertainty. They expanded their diets to include many species. They moved across landscapes rather than staying in one place for too long. They shared food within groups, helping distribute the benefits of occasional success. Even with these strategies, the natural world remained unpredictable. In the deep past of our species, food security was never permanent. It existed only as a temporary balance between human knowledge and the shifting patterns of the environment. Within that balance, hunger could still appear quickly, not because humans lacked skill or intelligence, but because the ecosystems they depended on were always in motion. Over many generations, humans learned to live inside this shifting world of food, but learning did not make the system stable. Knowledge could guide people toward likely sources of nourishment, yet it could never guarantee success. Even the most experienced groups moved through landscapes where the distance between a full stomach and an empty one could be surprisingly small. The ecosystems that supported early human life were complex networks of plants, animals, weather, and geography. When one part of that network changed, the consequences could ripple quickly through the rest. A season with less rainfall might reduce the growth of certain plants. Fewer plants might lead grazing animals to move elsewhere. When those animals moved, the opportunities for hunting disappeared with them. In such situations, the loss of one resource often meant the loss of several others at the same time. Archaeological research suggests that early humans adapted by remaining highly mobile. Camps were rarely permanent. Instead, groups shifted their locations as conditions changed, sometimes following familiar routes across wide territories. Mobility allowed people to search for new resources when local ones became scarce. Yet movement also carried risks. Traveling required energy, and long journeys could lead to unfamiliar landscapes where food was harder to locate. The need to move constantly revealed something important about the human relationship with food in the deep past. Survival depended on responding to change rather than eliminating it. In modern societies, systems are often designed to reduce uncertainty. Food is grown in controlled fields, stored in large quantities, and transported across long distances. These systems attempt to smooth out the natural fluctuations that once shaped daily life. Early humans had no such buffer. They lived directly within ecological rhythms that humans could observe but not control. When those rhythms shifted suddenly, the effects were immediate. One way to understand this fragility is to imagine how small the margin of safety could be. A group might live near a coastline rich with shellfish, gathering enough food each day to meet their needs. But a strong storm could alter the shoreline, burying shellfish beds under sand or changing the tides that made harvesting possible. A hunting territory might support several herds of animals, yet a harsh winter could reduce their numbers dramatically. A forest that normally provided edible fruits might fail to produce them during an unusual climate cycle. None of these events required dramatic disasters. Ordinary environmental variation was often enough. Because food sources were scattered and temporary, losing even a few of them could disrupt the delicate balance that sustained a community. Anthropologists often describe hunter-gatherer lifeways as flexible, and this flexibility was essential. People expanded their diets to include a wide range of species. They developed tools to dig roots, crack shells, and process plant fibers that might otherwise be inedible. They shared knowledge across generations, teaching younger members of the group how to recognize edible plants, track animals, and read seasonal signs in the environment. These practices helped reduce risk, but they could never remove it entirely. The deeper reason lies in the structure of natural ecosystems themselves. Wild landscapes rarely concentrate food in the way human agriculture does. Energy flows through these systems in dispersed and unpredictable ways. A human group could only gather what the environment happened to produce at that moment. If production declined or shifted elsewhere, people had to adjust quickly. This constant adjustment shaped the human experience of hunger. Hunger was not always a long-term famine or a dramatic collapse of society. More often it appeared quietly, as the realization that familiar food sources had become harder to find. A valley that once offered reliable plants might suddenly feel empty. Animal tracks might become less frequent along known paths. Fishing waters might yield fewer catches than before. In such moments, early humans were reminded that food was never guaranteed. The stability many people associate with meals today is a very recent development in the long history of our species. For most of that history, the human relationship with nourishment was defined by movement, observation, and adaptation within a world where abundance could fade quickly. Understanding this fragile beginning helps explain why the possibility of sudden hunger remained a constant companion throughout the deep past of humanity. The natural world that early humans depended on was never still. Landscapes changed slowly across centuries, but they also shifted in smaller ways from year to year and season to season. Rainfall could arrive later than expected. A cold period might shorten the growing season for plants. Rivers could swell, shrink, or change their paths. None of these changes required dramatic catastrophe, yet each had the potential to alter the availability of food. For people living directly within these environments, the difference between a productive season and a difficult one could begin with something as simple as a change in weather patterns. In many ecosystems, plants form the foundation of the food web. When plant growth is strong, herbivores have more to eat, and predators eventually benefit as well. When plant growth weakens, the effects ripple outward. Early human groups were part of this same network. Edible plants, fruits, nuts, and seeds often depended on particular combinations of temperature, sunlight, and rainfall. If those conditions shifted even slightly, the quantity or timing of edible harvests could change. In some years, the plants people relied on might produce less fruit or seed. In other years, the timing of ripening could move earlier or later, making it harder to gather them before animals consumed them or before they spoiled. These patterns were not unusual. They were part of the normal variability of natural ecosystems. Yet normal variability could still create periods of scarcity. Because early humans relied on many small food sources rather than large stored reserves, a reduction in several resources at once could become noticeable very quickly. A dry season might reduce plant growth in one region. Animals that normally fed on those plants might move toward areas with more vegetation. Human groups that depended on both the plants and the animals would suddenly face fewer opportunities in the same landscape. The result was not necessarily famine in the dramatic sense often imagined today. Instead, it might appear as a gradual thinning of available food. Gathering trips might return with smaller harvests. Hunting attempts might take longer to succeed. The time and energy required to obtain enough calories would increase. Over days or weeks, these small changes could accumulate into a serious challenge. Climate variability was not the only factor influencing food availability. Natural disturbances also played an important role. Storms could damage vegetation or reshape coastlines where shellfish were gathered. Flooding could temporarily alter river ecosystems that supported fish populations. Fires, which occur naturally in many environments, could destroy plants in one area while eventually encouraging new growth in another. For human groups moving through these landscapes, such disturbances created a constantly shifting map of opportunity and risk. What had been a reliable place to gather food one year might become far less productive the next. Evidence from paleo-environmental studies suggests that even during periods of relatively stable climate, local environments could fluctuate in ways that affected human subsistence. Lakes expanded and contracted. Grasslands shifted their boundaries. Forest composition changed gradually as some plant species became more common while others declined. These changes might seem slow from a geological perspective, but for people depending on those resources day by day, the effects could be immediate. A change in plant species could mean that familiar foods were no longer present in the same quantities or locations. The important point is that uncertainty was not an occasional feature of early human life. It was a constant background condition. Knowledge and experience helped people anticipate seasonal patterns, but they could not eliminate the variability of the environment itself. Each year carried the possibility that the landscape would behave differently from the year before. Within this unpredictable setting, human communities developed ways of coping with instability. They diversified their diets, learning to use many different plants and animals rather than relying heavily on a single species. They maintained mobility so they could move toward areas where food was more abundant. They passed down ecological knowledge across generations, allowing younger members of the group to recognize subtle environmental signals. These strategies made survival possible, but they did not transform the environment into a reliable provider of food. The deeper structure of the natural world remained unchanged. Rain still fell unevenly, seasons still varied, animals still migrated according to their own needs. Early humans lived within these dynamics rather than above them, and because of this, the risk of hunger could never be fully removed. A few small environmental changes, occurring together in the wrong moment, could narrow the margin between sufficient food and sudden scarcity. Weather and climate influence food in ways that are often subtle at first. A few days of unexpected cold can slow the growth of plants that depend on warmth. A brief period without rain can delay the flowering of species that normally provide fruits or seeds. For early humans living directly within these ecosystems, such changes were not distant environmental statistics. They shaped the rhythm of daily life. When plants grow later than expected, animals that depend on those plants may alter their movements. Insects that pollinate flowers may appear at slightly different times. The delicate timing that connects many living things in an ecosystem can shift, sometimes by only a small margin, but enough to change where food can be found. One of the most important features of wild ecosystems is that they operate through these chains of dependency. Plants depend on soil conditions, temperature, and moisture. Herbivores depend on plants. Predators depend on herbivores. Humans, especially in the long period before agriculture, were woven into this same structure. When one part of the chain shifted, the effects often travelled outward. If a plant population declined in a certain area, animals might move away in search of better feeding grounds. When those animals moved, hunting opportunities changed as well. The result was that environmental variation could reshape the entire food landscape within a relatively short time. In many regions of the world, seasonal cycles intensified this effect. Some ecosystems produce most of their edible resources during a short period of the year. For example, certain plants may release seeds only once during a brief seasonal window. If unusual weather disrupted that period, the opportunity to gather those seeds might shrink or disappear altogether. For people relying on such resources, the loss would not simply reduce variety in the diet. It could remove a significant portion of the calories that normally supported the group during that season. Animal behavior also contributes to this uncertainty. Many animals migrate or move across territories in response to food availability, temperature, or breeding cycles. These movements can be predictable over long periods, but they are rarely perfectly regular. A herd that normally passes through a valley each year may arrive earlier or later depending on environmental conditions. If humans reach the valley at the wrong time, the opportunity to hunt might vanish entirely. Even a delay of a few weeks could make the difference between a successful hunting season and an empty landscape. Archaeological research suggests that early humans were highly attentive to these patterns. Knowledge of animal migration routes, plant ripening periods, and seasonal water sources was crucial for survival. Yet knowledge alone could not stabilize the environment. It could only improve the chances of being in the right place at the right time. When environmental signals changed unexpectedly, human groups had to adapt quickly. Sometimes this meant traveling farther in search of new resources. Sometimes it meant relying more heavily on less desirable foods that were harder to gather or process. These adjustments reveal something important about the relationship between humans and food in the deep past. The system did not fail only during extreme disasters. It could also become strained through ordinary variation. A slightly weaker plant harvest combined with fewer animals in the area might already be enough to create difficulty. The margin between balance and scarcity was often narrow. For this reason, early humans rarely depended entirely on a single food source. Anthropological studies show that hunter-gatherer diets often include dozens or even hundreds of plant and animal species. This diversity reduced the impact of any one failure. If a certain fruit crop was poor, other foods might still be available. If a hunting attempt failed, gathering might provide enough nourishment to continue searching the next day. However, diversity did not eliminate vulnerability. When environmental conditions affected several resources at once, the protective effect of variety could weaken. A dry season might reduce both plant growth and the animals that feed on those plants. A prolonged cold period might influence multiple species simultaneously. When this happened, the environment could feel suddenly less generous. Food was still present somewhere in the landscape, but finding enough of it became more difficult and time-consuming. In these moments, the instability of the natural world became especially visible. Early humans lived within ecosystems where energy flowed through many pathways, and any change in those pathways could alter the availability of nourishment. The world that shaped our species was therefore not only rich in life, but also constantly shifting. Within that shifting system, the risk of hunger was never far away, because the environment itself was always capable of changing the rules that governed where food could be found. Even when environmental changes were small, their effects could accumulate in ways that gradually reshaped the food landscape around human groups. A slight decline in rainfall over several seasons might not appear dramatic at first. Plants might still grow, and animals might still be present. Yet the density of vegetation could slowly thin, and the animals that depended on that vegetation might begin to spread across wider territories in search of food. For humans who relied on those same ecosystems, the result would not necessarily be an immediate crisis. Instead, it could appear as a quiet shift in effort. Gathering might take longer than before. Hunting paths that once showed clear signs of animals might grow less active. Fishing spots that once produced regularly might become less reliable. These changes did not need to occur suddenly to create risk. Over time, they could narrow the margin of safety that allowed a community to meet its daily needs. One reason these shifts mattered so much lies in the scale at which wild food resources exist. Unlike cultivated crops, which concentrate large amounts of edible energy in one location, wild foods are usually distributed across broad areas. A group seeking enough nourishment had to gather many small resources across the landscape. If each of those resources became slightly harder to find, the combined effect could become significant. The energy required to obtain food might begin to approach the energy gained from eating it. In ecological terms, this balance between effort and reward is crucial. When obtaining food requires too much time or movement, the system becomes fragile. Any additional disruption can push it towards scarcity. Environmental variability also influenced water sources, which in turn shaped where both animals and humans could travel. Streams might dry earlier than usual in a hot season. Lakes could shrink during long dry periods. When water became less available, animals often moved toward remaining sources, concentrating in certain areas while leaving others empty. Human groups observing these patterns might follow the same movements, but the concentration of animals near limited water also increased competition with other predators. In such situations, success was never guaranteed. A group might arrive at a water source only to discover that the animals had already moved on again. The unpredictability of weather added another layer to this dynamic. Storms could alter landscapes quickly. Heavy rains might flood valleys, temporarily changing the location of edible plants or driving animals into different habitats. Strong winds could damage fruit-bearing trees or scatter seeds before they could be gathered. Coastal environments, where many early humans collected shellfish and other marine resources, were especially sensitive to storms and shifting tides. A coastline that offered reliable harvesting one year might become more difficult to use after natural disturbances reshaped the shore. These processes illustrate a central feature of the natural world in which humans evolved. Stability was often temporary. Ecosystems did not remain fixed long enough for humans to depend on them with complete certainty. Instead, landscapes continuously adjusted to changing weather patterns, animal migrations, and plant cycles. Human groups responded with flexibility, but flexibility required constant attention. People needed to observe the land, remember past patterns, and adapt their movements accordingly. The ability to notice subtle environmental signals became an essential survival skill. Over thousands of years, this close relationship with the environment shaped human awareness. Knowledge about the land was not abstract information, but practical understanding tied directly to nourishment and survival. Elders might remember which valleys produced certain plants during wet years, or which hillsides sheltered animals during cold seasons. This knowledge could guide younger members of the group when conditions began to shift. Yet even the most detailed knowledge could not eliminate uncertainty. The environment sometimes behaved in ways that differed from past experience. A plant that had always appeared reliably might fail during an unusual climate cycle. A migration route might change after a severe winter affected animal populations. When such events occurred, human communities had to respond quickly, exploring new areas or experimenting with unfamiliar food sources. These adjustments reveal the deeper reason why hunger could appear suddenly in human history. The systems that provided food were not controlled by humans. They were shaped by natural forces operating across entire ecosystems. A few environmental changes, each modest on its own, could combine to transform the landscape of available nourishment. Within that shifting system, the boundary between abundance and scarcity remained thin. Early humans survived through adaptability, cooperation, and careful observation, but they still lived in a world where the environment could alter the conditions of survival faster than any group could fully predict. In many modern images of early human life, hunting appears as the central activity that sustained entire communities. Paintings and films often show groups returning from the landscape carrying large animals, suggesting that meat provided a steady and reliable foundation for survival. Archaeological evidence, however, presents a more complex picture. Hunting certainly played an important role in human history, but it was rarely predictable. For most of the deep past, hunting was an uncertain effort in which success could never be assumed. The animals humans pursued moved through environments according to their own needs rather than according to human plans. They followed water, vegetation, breeding cycles, and seasonal migrations that often changed from year to year. Even when people understood these patterns well, reaching the right place at the right time required patience and careful movement across large territories. A herd that had been present a few days earlier might already be gone by the time hunters arrived. In such situations, the effort invested in tracking and travel could produce no food at all. This uncertainty shaped the way human groups approached hunting. Rather than relying on it as the sole source of nourishment, many communities treated hunting as one opportunity among many. Gathering plants, collecting insects, fishing, and harvesting shellfish often contributed significantly to daily survival. These activities provided smaller amounts of food, but could be repeated more regularly. Hunting, in contrast, often brought large rewards only occasionally. When successful, a hunt could provide enough meat to feed a group for several days. When unsuccessful, it produced nothing except the loss of time and energy. The challenge of hunting lies partly in the abilities of the animals themselves. Many species that humans pursued were well adapted to detecting danger. Their senses of smell, hearing, and vision allowed them to notice approaching predators long before contact occurred. Animals also moved quickly across landscapes that were familiar to them. A deer or antelope could disappear into dense vegetation or run across open ground faster than most human hunters could follow. Even smaller animals often possessed escape strategies that made capture difficult. Burrowing species could retreat underground, and birds could take flight before a hunter came close enough. Because of these difficulties, early humans developed a wide range of hunting strategies. Some involved careful tracking and quiet approach. Others relied on cooperation, where groups of hunters worked together to drive animals toward traps or into narrow spaces where escape became harder. In certain regions, humans used natural features of the landscape, such as cliffs or riverbanks, to limit the movement of prey. These methods increased the chances of success, but they never removed the element of uncertainty. Animals could change direction unexpectedly, or environmental conditions could interfere with the plan. Rain might wash away tracks, making it harder to follow a herd. Wind might carry human scent toward animals before hunters were ready. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that many hunting attempts likely ended without success. Animal bones found at ancient camps often represent only occasional events rather than daily occurrences. In some regions, the remains of small animals appear more frequently than those of large game, indicating that people sometimes relied on easier targets when larger prey could not be captured. This pattern reflects a practical response to the unpredictable nature of hunting. Smaller animals may provide less meat, but they are often more abundant and require less coordination to capture. The deeper implication is that hunting rarely guaranteed immediate nourishment. A group might spend hours or even days searching for suitable prey without obtaining any food. During those times, other members of the community often continued gathering plants or collecting smaller resources to maintain the group's energy. This balance between hunting and gathering reduced risk, yet it also highlights the fragile structure of the ancient food system. When hunting failed repeatedly, and other food sources were also limited, the threat of hunger could appear quickly. In the long history of our species, the pursuit of animals was therefore both an opportunity and a gamble. Hunting could bring valuable nutrition and strengthen social cooperation, but it never provided the kind of stability that modern food systems often create. Humans evolved within landscapes where success in obtaining meat was intermittent, and where survival depended on adapting to a world in which even the most skilled hunters could return empty-handed. Even when hunters located animals, success was far from certain. Tracking prey across open land or through forests required patience and skill, but also conditions that favored the hunters. Wind direction, ground texture, and visibility could influence the outcome long before a hunter came close to the animal. If the wind carried human scent toward a herd, the animals might detect danger and move away before the hunters ever saw them. If the ground was rocky or dry, tracks might disappear quickly, leaving little information about where the prey had gone. These small environmental details could quietly determine whether a hunt ended in success or failure. Animals themselves were not passive targets. Over countless generations, they had evolved strategies to avoid predators. Many species remain constantly alert while feeding, lifting their heads frequently to scan the surroundings. Herd animals often rely on group awareness, where several individuals watch for danger while others graze. When one animal detects movement or scent, the entire group can react instantly. This collective vigilance makes it difficult for predators, including humans, to approach unnoticed. Even when hunters were skilled trackers, they often needed to move slowly and cautiously to avoid triggering this early warning system. Another challenge came from the energy required to pursue prey. Large animals such as deer, antelope, or wild cattle could travel long distances while fleeing. Following them across the landscape might take hours or even days. Some hunting strategies involved persistence, where hunters tracked an animal gradually until it became exhausted. Such methods required physical endurance and knowledge of the terrain, but they also carried risk. If the animal escaped into terrain that was difficult to cross, or if weather conditions changed, the opportunity could disappear. The hunters might return with nothing despite their effort. Smaller animals could also be difficult to obtain. Many species hide effectively within dense vegetation or underground burrows. Catching them often required tools such as digging implements, traps, or carefully constructed snares. These techniques improved the chances of capture, yet they still depended on the presence of animals in the right place at the right time. If the local population of a species had moved elsewhere or declined during a particular season, even well-placed traps could remain empty. Evidence from archaeological research suggests that early human communities used a variety of hunting approaches precisely because no single method worked reliably in every situation. Some strategies focused on cooperation within the group. Hunters might work together to surround animals or drive them toward narrow passages in the landscape where escape routes were limited. Other strategies relied on patience, waiting near watering areas where animals were likely to appear. In coastal regions, people sometimes exploited tidal cycles to capture fish or marine animals trapped in shallow waters. Each of these methods increased the probability of success, but none could eliminate the underlying unpredictability of wild animals. The movements of prey were shaped by environmental conditions beyond human control. Drought might push animals toward distant grazing areas. Harsh winters could reduce animal populations, leaving fewer opportunities for hunters. Changes in plant growth might redirect herds along new migration routes that bypassed familiar hunting territories. In these situations, knowledge gained from previous seasons might suddenly become less useful. Hunters could arrive at a traditional location only to discover that the animals had chosen a different path that year. Because of this uncertainty, hunting often functioned as part of a broader survival strategy rather than the sole foundation of the diet. Gathering plants, collecting insects, and harvesting other small resources helped provide a steady baseline of nourishment. When hunting succeeded, the reward could be significant, bringing valuable protein and fat to the community. When it failed, the group still relied on these other sources to continue searching for food. Yet there were moments when several sources of nourishment became scarce at the same time. A difficult season might reduce plant growth while also altering animal movements. During such periods, the failure of hunting carried greater consequences. Without the occasional success that normally supplemented other foods, the available calories could decline quickly. This fragile balance explains why the act of hunting, despite its importance, did not guarantee food security in the long history of our species. Even skilled hunters operating within well-known landscapes faced a world where animals remained independent actors, responding to environmental changes that humans could observe but never fully control. Over long stretches of time, the uncertainty of hunting shaped how human communities thought about food. A successful hunt could bring a sudden abundance of meat, sometimes more than a small group could eat in a single day, but that moment of abundance carried its own limits. Without reliable ways to preserve large quantities of meat for long periods, much of it had to be consumed quickly or shared widely. This pattern meant that the rewards of hunting were often temporary. One day might provide more food than a group needed, while the following days might offer none at all. The rhythm created by this pattern was uneven, alternating between brief periods of plenty and longer stretches where food had to be obtained again through careful effort. Evidence from ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer societies suggests that sharing was one way communities reduced the risk created by this uneven rhythm. When hunters succeeded, the meat was often distributed among many members of the group. Sharing helped ensure that everyone benefited from occasional success, and it strengthened social bonds that would matter during future periods of scarcity. If one hunter returned empty-handed on a later day, others might provide food in return for past generosity. This system of cooperation did not remove the unpredictability of hunting, but it helped spread its benefits and its risks across the entire community. Even with cooperation, however, the outcome of hunting remained uncertain from one day to the next. Large animals might appear only rarely in certain landscapes. Smaller prey could be abundant, yet difficult to capture consistently. Weather conditions could interfere with tracking, and animal movements could shift without warning. Because of this, human groups often treated successful hunts as opportunities rather than expectations. A hunt that produced meat was valuable precisely because it could not be assumed. The deeper significance of this uncertainty becomes clearer when we consider the energetic needs of the human body. Humans require a regular supply of calories to maintain movement, warmth, and cognitive function. When food becomes scarce, the body begins to draw on stored energy, but those reserves are limited. In environments where hunting success was unpredictable, the delay between one successful hunt and the next could place pressure on the entire group. The time spent searching for animals might increase just when energy levels were declining. This delicate balance between effort and nourishment explains why many early human diets were built around flexibility. Hunting provided valuable nutrients, especially protein and fat, but it rarely operated alone. Plant foods, small animals, fish, insects, and other resources helped stabilize daily intake when hunting attempts did not succeed. The variety of these foods reduced the likelihood that a group would depend entirely on a single uncertain activity. Yet even a diverse diet could not eliminate risk if several food sources became scarce at the same time. When this happened, the absence of successful hunts could be felt more strongly. Archaeological discoveries sometimes reveal clusters of animal bones at particular sites, suggesting that hunting success occasionally occurred in dramatic bursts. A group might encounter a herd in a favorable location, or drive animals into a natural trap created by the landscape. In such moments, the abundance of meat could temporarily transform the food situation of a community. But these events appear irregular rather than constant in the archaeological record. They represent moments of opportunity rather than everyday stability. Between these moments, people return to the slower process of searching for nourishment across the land. The broader lesson of hunting in human history is therefore not simply about skill or courage. It is about the unpredictable relationship between humans and the animals they depended on. Prey species lived according to ecological forces that humans could observe but never fully direct. Herds migrated, populations fluctuated, and individual animals reacted quickly to danger. As a result, hunting existed within a system where success could never be guaranteed. This reality shaped the structure of early human survival. Communities learned to cooperate, diversify their diets, and remain attentive to the signals of the landscape. Yet the possibility always remained that several days might pass without a successful hunt. In those moments, the fragile balance between effort and nourishment became clear. The ancient pursuit of animals provided important sustenance, but it also reminded humans that food could disappear from reach faster than it could be secured. Even when food was finally obtained, another challenge remained. For most of human history, keeping that food for later was extremely difficult. In the modern world, preservation often happens quietly in the background. Refrigeration slows the growth of bacteria. Dry storage protects grains from moisture. Canning and freezing extend the life of foods for months or even years. These technologies create the impression that abundance can be stored and used whenever it is needed. Early humans lived in a very different reality. Most foods available in the natural world begin to change almost immediately after they are gathered or killed. Meat spoils quickly in warm environments. Fruits soften and decay. Fish and shellfish deteriorate rapidly once removed from water. Without reliable preservation methods, the time between obtaining food and losing it could be very short. This limitation shaped how early human communities experienced abundance. A successful hunt might produce a large quantity of meat, yet the group could not simply store that meat for many weeks. Some preservation techniques existed in certain environments. Drying meat in the sun or smoking it over fire could slow spoilage, and in cold climates, low temperatures sometimes acted as a natural form of preservation. However, these methods were not always available or reliable in every place and season. Humid conditions, insects, and bacteria could quickly reduce the effectiveness of such efforts. As a result, much of the food obtained in the deep past had to be consumed soon after it was acquired. This created a pattern where moments of success did not necessarily translate into long-term security. A group might eat well for a short period after obtaining meat or gathering a large quantity of plants. But once those foods were consumed or spoiled, the search for nourishment began again almost immediately. The inability to maintain large reserves meant that communities remained closely tied to the daily productivity of the environment around them. In this sense, the ancient food system functioned more like a flowing stream than a stored reservoir. Energy entered human life continuously through the act of finding and collecting food, but it rarely accumulated in large, stable quantities. The body itself served as the primary storage system, converting excess calories into fat that could be used later. Yet even this biological reserve had limits. A few days of abundance could not fully protect a community against longer periods when food became scarce. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that early humans were aware of these limits and adapted their behavior accordingly. Sharing food within groups was one response. When a hunter obtained more meat than a single household could consume quickly, distributing portions among others helped ensure that less of the resource went to waste. Sharing also strengthened relationships that could be crucial during future periods when food was harder to find. In this way, social networks partly compensated for the absence of large physical storage systems. Even so, sharing did not eliminate the fundamental problem of preservation. Once the available food was eaten or spoiled, everyone in the group faced the same need to search for the next source of nourishment. The passage of time therefore had a different meaning in the food economy of early humans. Each day without success brought the community closer to the limits of its remaining energy. The following day might restore balance through a successful hunt or a productive gathering trip, but there was no guarantee that it would. The environment could remain unproductive for longer than expected, especially during difficult seasons. During those periods, the absence of stored food made the situation more urgent. Modern societies often rely on storage precisely to avoid this type of pressure. Grain harvested in one season can feed people months later. Refrigerated foods can remain edible long after they are purchased. These systems reduce the immediate consequences of environmental change. In contrast, the ancient relationship between humans and food allowed very little distance between success and vulnerability. Even when the land provided generously for a moment, the lack of durable storage meant that this generosity faded quickly. The result was a constant return to the same task that had defined human survival for countless generations, moving through the landscape once again in search of nourishment that might appear today, but could disappear tomorrow. Even the foods that seemed abundant in nature rarely remained usable for long. Fruits and berries, for example, often appear in large numbers during a short harvest period. For a few days or weeks, a landscape may feel generous as plants produce ripe food all at once, yet this abundance fades quickly. Fruits fall, dry out, or become overripe. Birds and other animals consume large portions of the crop. What once seemed plentiful can vanish within a surprisingly short time. Early humans moving through such environments experienced this pattern repeatedly. A place that offered a rich harvest during one visit might provide almost nothing when people returned only a few weeks later. The same was true for many other natural foods. Fish may gather in large numbers during certain moments of the year, often connected to spawning cycles or seasonal migrations. These events can create brief periods where catching fish becomes easier, but once the migration ends, the concentration disappears, and the water returns to its normal state, where fish are far more difficult to capture. Shellfish beds along coastlines can also fluctuate depending on tides, storms, and ecological changes in the water. These cycles mean that abundance in nature often arrives suddenly and then fades just as quickly. Because early humans had limited ways to preserve large quantities of food, they had to adjust their behavior to these narrow windows of opportunity. When food appeared in large amounts, people often gathered or hunted intensively during that moment. The goal was not to create long-term storage, but to take advantage of the temporary availability while it lasted. This pattern can still be observed in many traditional foraging societies studied by anthropologists. A successful harvest of plants or a large catch of fish may lead to several days of plentiful meals, but the community soon returns to its regular pattern of searching once those foods are consumed. This rhythm reveals an important feature of human life before large-scale food preservation. Abundance did not accumulate over time. Instead, it moved through human communities in waves. A short period of plenty might be followed by a return to careful searching and rationing. Because these waves were unpredictable, people could never assume that the next one would arrive immediately after the previous one ended. In some cases, natural preservation processes helped extend the life of certain foods. Seeds and nuts can remain edible longer than fresh fruits or meat, especially when stored in dry conditions. Some groups learned to smoke or dry strips of meat, slowing the process of spoilage. Yet even these methods depended on favorable conditions and knowledge passed through generations. In many climates, humidity and insects quickly threatened stored food. Maintaining large reserves required protection from animals, moisture, and decay, challenges that were difficult to manage without permanent structures or specialized containers. For this reason, early humans often relied more on movement than storage. When a resource in one location began to decline, groups could travel toward areas where other foods were becoming available. This strategy allowed people to follow the shifting productivity of the landscape rather than attempting to hold resources in one place. Mobility became a form of security, but it also meant that food supplies were always temporary. Every location had its season, and every season eventually ended. The result was a food system defined by timing. A group arriving too late might find that animals had already moved on or that plants had finished producing edible parts. Arriving too early could also be a problem, because fruits might still be unripe or animals not yet present. Knowledge of these seasonal rhythms helped guide human movement, but it could never eliminate the risk that conditions would change unexpectedly. Weather might shift the timing of plant growth. Migration patterns might alter the arrival of animals. Even slight variations in temperature or rainfall could affect when resources appeared. These uncertainties meant that early humans lived with a constant awareness of how quickly food could fade from the landscape. A forest heavy with fruit in one moment might be nearly empty not long afterward. A river filled with fish during one season might offer only scattered catches later in the year. Because preservation was limited and natural abundance was brief, the human relationship with nourishment remained closely tied to the immediate present. Food had to be found again and again, and every success carried the quiet understanding that it would not last forever. The difficulty of preserving food meant that early human communities lived with a constant awareness of time. Food was not only something that had to be found, it was something that had to be eaten before it disappeared. In warm environments especially, the natural processes that break down organic material begin almost immediately. Microorganisms multiply, insects arrive, and the texture and smell of food gradually change. Without effective preservation methods, these processes limit how long food remains safe to eat. For people living close to the land, this created a practical boundary around every successful harvest or hunt. The window between abundance and spoilage could be surprisingly short. Because of this, the moment when food became available often triggered immediate activity within the group. If hunters returned with meat, the community might gather to process it quickly. Portions could be roasted, dried, or smoked if conditions allowed, but much of it would be consumed while it was still fresh. In a similar way, when a patch of edible plants was discovered, people might harvest as much as possible before animals, weather, or decay reduced the supply. These responses reveal that early human communities were constantly negotiating the balance between opportunity and loss. Abundance was valuable, but it was also temporary. Once the food was gone or spoiled, the landscape returned to its quieter state where nourishment had to be searched for again. This pattern helps explain why human societies place strong emphasis on cooperation and distribution. Sharing food allowed the benefits of a successful hunt or harvest to reach many individuals quickly, reducing the chance that resources would go to waste. It also created a social system that could help buffer short-term shortages. If one person or household had recently benefited from shared food, they might provide help to others when their own success arrived later. In this way, the social structure of human communities partly compensated for the absence of reliable storage. Cooperation did not eliminate the risk of scarcity, but it allowed groups to distribute the temporary surpluses that occasionally appeared. Yet even with cooperation and careful use of food, the underlying challenge remained. Once the available resources were consumed, people returned to the same uncertain environment that had shaped their lives before the moment of abundance. The next successful hunt or gathering trip could occur soon, or it could take longer than expected. The absence of preserved reserves meant that communities remained sensitive to short interruptions in the flow of food. A few days without success might already begin to test the limits of what the group could endure. This situation reveals an important difference between the ancient human experience of food and the modern one. Today, many societies rely on systems designed to separate the act of obtaining food from the act of eating it. Crops harvested in one place can be stored, transported, and consumed months later in another location. Refrigeration slows decay, and global supply networks redistribute food across vast distances. These systems create a buffer between environmental variability and daily life. Early humans did not possess such buffers. Their survival depended on the immediate productivity of the environments they inhabited. When those environments provided food, the community could eat well. When conditions changed or resources disappeared, the need to search began again without delay. Over countless generations, humans adapted to this pattern. The body learned to store energy during times of abundance and use it gradually when food was scarce. Cultural practices evolved that encouraged sharing and cooperation. Knowledge about plants, animals, and seasonal cycles became essential for guiding movement across the land. These adaptations allowed human groups to survive within a system that offered nourishment irregularly, yet they did not remove the central reality that shaped most of human history. Food was rarely secure for long. Even a moment of success carried the quiet understanding that it would fade quickly, leaving people once again dependent on the shifting opportunities of the natural world. Long before farms, markets, or permanent settlements appeared, the availability of food was closely tied to the rhythm of seasons. The landscapes where early humans lived did not produce nourishment in the same way throughout the year. Instead, resources followed repeating cycles that shaped when certain foods could be found and when they disappeared again. These cycles were not created by human decisions. They were driven by changes in sunlight, temperature, rainfall, and the biological responses of plants and animals to those conditions. Over many generations, human communities came to understand these patterns deeply, but understanding them did not remove the uncertainty that accompanied them. In many ecosystems, edible plants appear only during specific moments in the annual cycle. Fruits ripen after particular combinations of warmth and moisture. Seeds develop once flowering has occurred, and the growing season progresses. Leaves and shoots may be tender and nutritious for a short time, before becoming tough or bitter as the season advances. For people depending on these foods, timing mattered as much as location. Arriving at a place too early might mean the plants were not yet ready to eat. Arriving too late might mean the edible parts had already fallen, dried out, or been consumed by animals. This narrow timing created periods when gathering could be very productive, followed by longer stretches when the same landscape offered far less. Animals also followed seasonal rhythms that influence human access to food. Many species adjust their movements based on the availability of vegetation, water, or suitable temperatures. Herd animals may travel long distances between feeding grounds during different times of the year. Fish often migrate during spawning seasons, creating brief periods when rivers or coastlines become especially rich in life. Birds may appear in large numbers during migration before continuing on their journeys. For early human communities, these movements created opportunities that were both valuable and temporary. A location that supported hunting during one season might be almost empty during another. Archaeological evidence suggests that human groups often moved in ways that reflected these seasonal changes. Campsites found in certain regions appear to have been used repeatedly at particular times of the year. Some sites contain evidence of plant processing that corresponds with known harvest seasons. Others show signs of fishing or hunting activities linked to seasonal migrations. These patterns indicate that early humans developed a detailed awareness of the environmental calendar around them. Yet, even with this knowledge, seasonal cycles could still produce difficult periods. Between times of abundance, there were often intervals when food became harder to find. In many traditional societies studied by anthropologists, these intervals are sometimes described as lean seasons. They occur when the previous harvest or migration has ended but the next one has not yet begun. During these periods, communities may rely on foods that are less preferred or more difficult to obtain. The existence of such intervals illustrates how strongly seasonal rhythms shape the human relationship with nourishment. Unlike modern food systems, which often smooth out seasonal variation through storage and transportation, early human life remained closely tied to the annual cycle of the environment. The consequences of this connection could be felt in daily routines. Activities that were productive during one part of the year might be far less effective during another. A valley rich with edible plants in spring might offer little during the colder months. A river filled with fish during migration might return to quiet waters once the fish had moved on. Human groups responded by adjusting their movements, tools, and strategies to match the changing landscape. Over time, these seasonal adjustments became deeply embedded in cultural knowledge. Elders could remember which valleys produced certain plants after rainy years, or when animals typically passed through particular territories. This knowledge helped communities anticipate opportunities and prepare for more difficult periods. But anticipation did not eliminate uncertainty. Weather could alter the timing of seasonal events, delaying or shortening the periods when food was available. A colder spring might postpone plant growth. An unusually dry year could reduce the productivity of landscapes that were normally dependable. In such cases, the seasonal calendar itself could shift, creating moments when expected resources failed to appear. The importance of seasons, therefore, reveals another reason why food could disappear quickly in the long history of our species. The natural world produced nourishment in waves tied to environmental cycles. Humans could observe these cycles and adapt their movements to follow them, but they could not guarantee that each season would behave exactly as before. When the rhythm of the environment changed even slightly, the delicate balance between abundance and scarcity could shift as well. Seasonal cycles did more than determine when certain foods appeared. They also created predictable intervals when food became harder to obtain. In many landscapes, the transition between seasons produced periods when the previous resources had already faded but the next ones had not yet emerged. These quiet gaps in the ecological calendar could stretch for weeks, sometimes longer, depending on local conditions. During these intervals, the environment offered fewer opportunities, and human communities had to rely on whatever foods remained available. These might include roots buried beneath the soil, small animals that were difficult to catch, or scattered plants that had survived from earlier growth. Such foods could sustain life, but they often required more time and effort to obtain. This pattern can still be observed in some traditional foraging societies studied by anthropologists. Researchers sometimes describe certain parts of the year as lean seasons, not because food disappears completely, but because obtaining enough nourishment becomes more challenging. The landscape still contains edible resources, yet they are fewer, harder to locate, or less energy-rich than those available during more productive times. During these periods, communities may expand the range of foods they collect, turning to species that are normally ignored when more desirable options are abundant. The effort required to gather food increases, and daily activities may revolve more heavily around searching for scattered resources. For early humans, these seasonal fluctuations created a rhythm that shaped how communities moved across the land. Groups often traveled between different ecological zones throughout the year, following the sequence of resources as they appeared. A coastal area might provide shellfish during certain months, while inland valleys might offer plant harvests at another time. Forest regions could supply fruits and nuts later in the cycle, and rivers might become important when fish migrations occurred. By moving between these places, human groups attempted to maintain access to nourishment throughout the year, yet even this strategy had limits. The timing of seasonal resources was influenced by environmental conditions that could vary from year to year. A shift in rainfall might delay plant growth. A colder season could affect the movement of animals. Storms might disturb coastal ecosystems that usually supported shellfish gathering. When these disruptions occurred, the familiar sequence of seasonal resources could become less reliable. A community arriving at a known harvesting place might discover that the expected plants had produced fewer fruits, or that animals had chosen a different route during migration. Seasonal patterns also influenced the energy balance of early human life. During productive periods, food might be relatively easy to gather, allowing communities to eat well and store energy within the body. These moments of abundance could help people prepare for the quieter intervals that followed. But because natural food resources were difficult to preserve for long periods, most of this abundance had to be used quickly. When the environment shifted toward a leaner season, the community often returned to the slower process of searching widely across the landscape for enough nourishment. Archaeological findings sometimes reflect this seasonal rhythm. At certain sites, evidence suggests repeated occupation during particular times of the year, likely connected to predictable harvests or animal migrations. Other sites show signs of temporary use, perhaps during shorter periods when specific resources were available. Together, these patterns suggest that early human communities organized their movements in response to the environmental calendar around them. They learned to anticipate when landscapes would become productive and when they would grow quiet again. Despite this knowledge, seasonal systems could still produce sudden difficulties. A community might expect the arrival of fish in a river or the ripening of fruits in a forest, only to find that environmental conditions had altered the timing. If the previous food sources had already disappeared, this delay could create an unexpected gap in the supply of nourishment. The delicate timing that normally connected one seasonal resource to the next might break, leaving a temporary period when food was scarce. These moments illustrate why hunger in human history did not always emerge from dramatic disasters. It could also arise from the ordinary transitions between seasons, especially when the natural rhythm of the environment shifted slightly. Early humans lived within a world where nourishment followed the turning of the year, appearing and fading according to patterns that were familiar yet never completely certain. Seasonal rhythms also influenced how early humans thought about the future. When a community understood that certain foods would return at particular times of the year, this knowledge offered a form of guidance, but it did not provide certainty. The environment could follow familiar patterns for many years and then behave differently during an unusual season. A drought might shorten the growing period for plants. An extended cold spell could delay the emergence of edible shoots or reduce the number of animals in a region. Because food resources were tied so closely to these cycles, even a small shift in seasonal timing could interrupt the sequence that normally connected one source of nourishment to another. When this happened, communities faced the challenge of filling the gap until the next resource appeared. One response was to widen the range of foods considered edible. Many plants and animals that are rarely eaten in times of abundance become important during lean periods. Roots buried deeper in the soil might be dug out, even though they require significant effort to prepare. Insects and small animals may be collected more frequently when larger prey are scarce. Certain seeds that are difficult to process might become valuable simply because they remain available when other foods have disappeared. These adjustments show that early humans possessed remarkable flexibility in their diets. However, the need to rely on such foods also reveals how sensitive the system could be to seasonal change. Another strategy involved shifting movement patterns across the landscape. If a particular area became less productive during part of the year, groups might travel toward regions where different ecological conditions created new opportunities. Mountain valleys, river corridors, coastal shores, and open grasslands often offered different resources at different times. By moving between these environments, human communities attempted to maintain a continuous flow of nourishment throughout the year. This approach required deep knowledge of geography and timing. People needed to know when certain places became productive and how long it would take to travel there. Yet even careful planning could be disrupted if seasonal conditions changed unexpectedly. Archaeological evidence suggests that the seasonal organization of human life has deep roots in our species' past. Remains found at ancient sites sometimes show signs of specific plant harvests or animal hunting that correspond with particular times of the year. The presence of certain fish species in archaeological deposits can indicate that communities visited those sites during seasonal migrations. Such findings reveal how closely human movement once followed the rhythm of natural resources. People returned to places not because they were permanently rich in food, but because they were briefly productive at predictable moments in the annual cycle. This seasonal dependence meant that the margin between stability and scarcity could be narrow. When the timing of environmental events shifted, the connection between successive food sources might break. A plant harvest might fail, and the next hunting opportunity might still be weeks away. In these intervals, the effort required to gather enough nourishment could increase dramatically. The group might spend longer hours searching for scattered resources, and the energy gained from those efforts might decline. Over time, such conditions could place increasing pressure on the community. These seasonal challenges help explain why human cultures develop detailed ecological knowledge. Stories, observations, and practical experience allowed people to remember when certain plants ripened or when animals usually appeared in specific places. This knowledge was shared across generations, creating a living record of the environment. Yet knowledge itself could not fully stabilize the system. The natural world sometimes changed its timing in ways that no memory could predict. When that happened, the carefully learned rhythm of the year could feel suddenly uncertain. The deeper lesson of seasonal life in early human history is that nourishment rarely arrived in a steady flow. Instead, it followed cycles of appearance and disappearance that repeated year after year but never in exactly the same way. Communities adapted to this rhythm with movement, cooperation, and flexible diets, but they remained dependent on environmental patterns beyond their control. In such a world, hunger did not always grow slowly over long periods. Sometimes it appeared when the expected rhythm of the seasons shifted just enough to interrupt the delicate chain that normally connected one source of food to the next. The irregular flow of food across seasons and landscapes did not only shape human behavior. Over many thousands of generations, it also shaped the human body itself. The biological systems that regulate hunger, energy storage, and metabolism developed within environments where meals were not guaranteed at regular intervals. For most of human history, food arrived unpredictably. Some days offered abundance, while others required patience and endurance. In response to this pattern, the human body evolved ways to cope with fluctuations in nourishment rather than relying on constant intake. One of the most important features of human metabolism is the ability to store energy for later use. When more calories are consumed than the body immediately needs, some of that energy is stored as fat. This stored energy becomes a reserve that can be used when food becomes scarce. In the ancient environments where humans evolved, this capacity would have been valuable. After a successful hunt or a productive harvest of plants, individuals who could store part of that surplus energy within their bodies had a greater chance of enduring the quieter days that followed. The presence of body fat in humans is therefore not simply a biological accident. It reflects an adaptation to a world where food availability changed frequently. Fat tissue acts as a form of temporary storage that the body can access when incoming food is limited. When calorie intake decreases, hormonal signals trigger the gradual release of stored energy. This process helps maintain basic functions such as maintaining body temperature, supporting brain activity, and allowing continued movement across the landscape. Without this ability to draw on internal reserves, even short interruptions in food availability could become life-threatening much more quickly. The human brain also plays a central role in this system. Although the brain represents only a small portion of total body weight, it requires a continuous supply of energy to function. In evolutionary terms, maintaining this energy supply would have been essential because cognitive abilities such as memory, planning, and observation were critical for locating food in complex environments. The body therefore developed mechanisms to prioritize energy delivery to the brain even during times of limited nourishment. Stored energy in fat tissue can be converted into forms that help sustain brain function when external food is temporarily unavailable. These biological features suggest that irregular access to food was a persistent condition during the long history of human evolution. If meals had always arrived at predictable times, the selective pressure for storing energy efficiently might have been weaker. Instead, the environments where early humans lived created repeated cycles of abundance and scarcity. Individuals whose bodies could handle these fluctuations were more likely to survive and pass their genes to the next generation. Over long periods, this process shaped the metabolic patterns that still exist in humans today. Yet the capacity to store energy does not eliminate the challenge of food scarcity. Body reserves can sustain life for a limited time, but they are not unlimited. The human body gradually consumes these stored resources when food is unavailable, and prolonged shortages eventually weaken physical strength and immune function. Early humans therefore depended not only on biological adaptation but also on behavior and cooperation to navigate periods of limited food. Gathering widely across landscapes, sharing resources within groups, and maintaining knowledge about seasonal opportunities all work together with biological mechanisms to support survival. Another important feature of human metabolism involves the way hunger signals guide behavior. Feelings of hunger encourage people to search for food before energy reserves become dangerously low. In ancient environments, this sensation served as an early warning system, prompting individuals to remain attentive to opportunities in the landscape. Hunger was therefore not merely discomfort. It was part of a biological communication system linking the body to the environment. When food was abundant, eating allowed energy reserves to recover. When food was scarce, hunger motivated continued effort to locate nourishment. The connection between metabolism and environment reveals that the human body carries the history of irregular food availability within its biological design. Our species did not evolve in a world where meals appeared on a fixed schedule. Instead, the body developed strategies to handle variation, storing energy when possible and drawing on those reserves when necessary. This adaptation allowed humans to persist within ecosystems where food could appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly, shaping the physiological foundation of survival across most of human history. The human body does not respond to food only in the moment it is eaten. Instead, it constantly adjusts internal processes depending on whether nourishment is plentiful or limited. These adjustments involve a complex network of hormones and metabolic pathways that regulate how energy moves through the body. In environments where food availability changed frequently, such flexibility would have been essential. When food was present, the body could absorb nutrients and rebuild its reserves. When food was scarce, it could slow certain processes and begin using stored energy to maintain basic functions. This ability to shift between states helped early humans survive within landscapes where meals could not be predicted with certainty. One part of this system involves the hormones that influence hunger and satiety. These chemical signals travel between the digestive system, fat tissue, and the brain, helping coordinate when the body seeks food and when it reduces appetite. In environments where food sometimes appeared in large quantities for short periods, these signals allowed people to take advantage of those moments by eating enough to replenish their energy reserves. Later, during quieter periods when food was harder to obtain, the same regulatory systems helped the body conserve energy and rely more heavily on stored resources. This biological flexibility allowed humans to function during short interruptions in food supply without immediate collapse. Metabolism also changes in response to prolonged scarcity. When the body receives fewer calories than it requires, it begins to adjust how energy is used. Some processes slow down, including the rate at which energy is expended during rest. This reduction helps stretch the available reserves for a longer period. Such adjustments are not perfect solutions, but they provide additional time for a person to locate new sources of nourishment. In the environments where early humans lived, even a small extension of endurance could make a difference. A few additional days of energy might allow a group to reach a new area where food was more available. Fat tissue again plays an important role in this system. It functions as a long-term energy reserve that can be accessed gradually when food intake declines. The human body converts stored fat into usable energy through metabolic pathways that release fatty acids into the bloodstream. These molecules can then be used by muscles and other tissues as fuel. During extended periods without food, additional biochemical processes help provide energy to organs that normally rely on glucose, including the brain. These metabolic shifts demonstrate that the human body is capable of adapting to temporary shortages, reflecting the irregular patterns of nourishment that characterized most of our evolutionary history. However, these adaptations also reveal their limits. While the body can adjust its metabolism and draw upon stored energy, these reserves cannot last indefinitely. As stored fat decreases and the body continues to function without sufficient intake, physical strength gradually declines. Immune responses may weaken, and the ability to perform demanding tasks such as traveling long distances or hunting becomes more difficult. For early humans, these physiological constraints meant that the window for finding new food sources was always limited. Biological flexibility could delay the consequences of scarcity, but it could not remove them entirely. Because of this, survival required both internal and external strategies. The internal strategy involved metabolic adjustments that conserved energy and allowed the body to function during short interruptions in food availability. The external strategy involved behaviors such as cooperation, sharing, and movement across the landscape to locate new resources. These two layers worked together. The body provided time by slowing energy use and drawing on stored reserves, while cultural knowledge and group cooperation increased the chances of finding nourishment before those reserves were exhausted. The existence of these biological systems offers a quiet clue about the conditions in which humans evolved. Bodies rarely develop complex mechanisms for coping with situations that almost never occur. The presence of metabolic flexibility, energy storage, and hunger signaling suggests that irregular access to food was a normal part of life for early humans. Our physiology reflects an ancient environment where the availability of nourishment rose and fell in ways that required constant adjustment. Even today, The human body still carries the memory of those conditions in the way it manages energy, balancing moments of abundance with the possibility that the next meal may not arrive as quickly as expected. The ability of the human body to adjust to irregular food availability also shaped how energy was used in daily life. In environments where nourishment could not be predicted, the balance between effort and intake became extremely important. Activities such as traveling long distances, digging for roots, climbing, or tracking animals required significant energy. If too much effort was spent without obtaining food, the body's reserves would decline rapidly. Over many generations, humans developed behavioral patterns that helped manage this balance, conserving energy when necessary while remaining ready to act when opportunities for food appeared. One way this balance can be seen is in the flexibility of human activity levels. Early humans were capable of intense physical effort when circumstances demanded it, but they also spent long periods in quieter activities when conditions did not favor immediate hunting or gathering. This pattern may appear inefficient from a modern perspective, yet it reflects a practical response to uncertain food supplies. When food was difficult to find, conserving energy allowed the body to extend the usefulness of its reserves. When a promising opportunity appeared, energy could then be directed toward obtaining food quickly. This rhythm between effort and rest mirrors the broader rhythm of abundance and scarcity in the environment. The human brain played a significant role in coordinating these decisions. Unlike many animals that rely primarily on instinctive patterns of feeding, humans combine physical capability with observation, memory, and planning. These cognitive abilities allow people to consider whether an effort is likely to produce food before investing energy in it. For example, a hunter might choose to follow fresh animal tracks, while ignoring older ones that are unlikely to lead to prey. A group might decide to travel toward a valley where edible plants have ripened in previous seasons rather than searching randomly across unfamiliar terrain. These decisions help conserve energy during uncertain times. Yet even with careful planning, the outcome of such efforts could never be guaranteed. Environmental conditions sometimes shifted in ways that disrupted the patterns people expected. A plant harvest might be delayed by unusual weather. Animal tracks might lead to a herd that had already moved on. In these moments, the body's internal reserves again became important. The stored energy within fat tissue allowed individuals to continue functioning while the search for new opportunities continued. Without this biological support, even brief periods without food might have forced people to abandon exploration too quickly. Another aspect of human physiology also reflects the long history of irregular nourishment. The way hunger and satisfaction influence attention and motivation. When energy reserves begin to decline, signals from the body encourage increased focus on locating food. This shift in attention can influence where people direct their effort and how they interpret signs in the environment. Subtle details such as animal tracks, plant growth patterns, or the behavior of birds may become more noticeable when the need for nourishment grows stronger. In this sense, the sensation of hunger acts not only as a signal of energy shortage, but also as a guide that directs human awareness toward potential sources of food. These physiological and behavioral systems together reveal how deeply the unpredictability of nourishment shaped human evolution. The body developed mechanisms for storing energy, adjusting metabolism, and guiding attention toward food-related opportunities. At the same time, human communities developed cultural practices that supported these biological strategies, including cooperation, knowledge sharing, and flexible movement across landscapes. None of these adaptations removed the possibility of hunger. Instead, they allowed people to live within environments where nourishment arrived unevenly. Over countless generations, survival depended on the ability to endure short interruptions in food supply, while remaining ready to respond quickly when new resources appeared. The human body, therefore, carries within it a record of this long relationship with uncertainty. Our metabolism, our hunger signals, and even the ways we distribute effort throughout the day all reflect a past in which meals did not arrive at predictable times. They were discovered through observation, patience, and movement across the land. Within that ancient world, the difference between a well-fed day and a difficult one often depended on whether the environment happened to offer food at the moment when human effort met opportunity. Long before written history, the human story left quiet traces in the ground. Layers of soil, fragments of bone, and scattered tools have preserved small pieces of information about how people lived and what they ate. Archaeology cannot reconstruct every detail of daily life in the deep past, yet it offers clues that help scientists understand the challenges early humans faced in obtaining food. Among the most revealing of these clues are the physical signs left on human skeletons themselves. Bones are living tissues that respond to the conditions experienced during life, and in some cases they preserve evidence of nutritional stress. One type of evidence appears in the growth patterns of bones and teeth. During childhood, the human body requires a steady supply of nutrients to support development. When food becomes limited for extended periods, growth can temporarily slow or pause. Later, when conditions improve and nourishment becomes more available, growth may resume. These interruptions sometimes leave faint marks in tooth enamel or subtle changes in bone structure. Scientists studying ancient remains occasionally identify such patterns, suggesting that individuals experienced episodes when food was not consistently available. These findings do not mean that every person in the past lived in constant hunger. Rather, they indicate that fluctuations in nourishment occurred often enough to leave detectable traces in the biological record. Another line of archaeological evidence comes from the types of animal and plant remains found at ancient sites. When a community had reliable access to certain foods, those species often appear regularly in the remains left behind. In contrast, when preferred foods became scarce, people sometimes turned to a wider range of resources. This shift can appear in the archaeological record as an increase in the diversity of species represented at a site. For example, bones of smaller animals may become more common alongside those of larger prey, suggesting that hunters expanded their efforts when larger game was harder to find. Similarly, plant remains from less common edible species may appear more frequently during certain periods. These patterns suggest that human communities responded to fluctuations in food availability by broadening their diets. Evidence of food processing also provides insight into how people coped with periods of limited resources. Archaeologists sometimes find tools associated with grinding seeds, cracking nuts, or extracting nutrients from plants that require considerable effort to prepare. The presence of these tools indicates that communities were willing to invest time and labor into processing foods that might otherwise seem difficult to use. In times when easily obtained foods were scarce, such labor-intensive resources could become important components of the diet. This flexibility demonstrates how human ingenuity helped extend the range of available nourishment. Environmental evidence preserved alongside archaeological sites can also reveal periods when food resources may have been less abundant. Sediment layers containing pollen or plant remains allow scientists to reconstruct past landscapes and climates. Changes in these records sometimes indicate shifts in vegetation or rainfall patterns that would have influenced the availability of edible plants and the animals that depended on them. When such environmental changes align with signs of dietary adjustment in human remains, researchers gain a clearer picture of how communities adapted to fluctuations in the natural world. It is important to recognize that these archaeological signals are often subtle. The record rarely presents a simple story of constant abundance or constant scarcity. Instead, it reveals a pattern of variation. Some periods show evidence of stable access to food, while others suggest that communities faced greater challenges in obtaining enough nourishment. This variation reflects the reality that early humans lived within ecosystems that were constantly changing. Their survival depended on responding to those changes with flexibility and knowledge. The bones, tools, and plant remains preserved in ancient sites, therefore, offer more than a list of foods consumed in the past. They reveal a deeper story about the relationship between humans and the environment that sustained them. Within these traces, researchers see evidence of adaptation to a world where nourishment could not always be predicted. Communities expanded their diets, developed new processing techniques, and moved across landscapes as conditions required. Yet the very presence of these adjustments reminds us that food availability in the deep past was rarely permanent. The archaeological record quietly reflects a history in which the search for nourishment was shaped by fluctuations in the environment, leaving behind small but meaningful signs of how often human life had to adapt to changing access to food. Archaeologists also study the distribution of food remains within ancient camps to understand how often certain resources were available. When people repeatedly obtained the same animals or plants in reliable quantities, the archaeological layers at a site often contain large numbers of those specific remains. In contrast, when food availability changed from season to season or year to year, the pattern becomes more varied. Instead of a single dominant resource, the remains may include many different species gathered at different times. This diversity can suggest that communities were adapting to fluctuating opportunities in the environment, collecting whatever foods happened to be accessible during particular periods. Such patterns appear at many prehistoric sites around the world. The remains of fish, small mammals, birds, insects, shellfish, seeds, nuts, and roots often occur together in archaeological deposits. This mixture does not necessarily mean that people preferred all of these foods equally. Rather, it reflects a flexible approach to nourishment in environments where reliable sources could not always be guaranteed. When larger animals were available, hunters likely focused their attention on those valuable resources. When those animals were scarce, smaller prey or plant foods may have played a greater role in daily survival. The archaeological record captures these adjustments as shifts in the proportions of species found within different layers of occupation. Another important clue comes from the presence of burned bones and plant remains in ancient hearths. Fire was widely used by early humans not only for warmth and protection, but also for cooking food. Cooking can make certain plants easier to digest and can help release nutrients that are otherwise difficult for the human body to access. Archaeologists sometimes discover charred seeds, roasted tubers, or fragments of cooked bone near ancient fireplaces. These remains show that people were actively transforming raw resources into edible meals. In some cases, the variety of foods prepared in these hearths suggests that communities relied on multiple sources of nourishment, perhaps as a way of reducing the risk that any single resource might fail. The tools associated with food preparation also offer insight into how humans adapted to changing availability. Grinding stones, for example, are often linked to the processing of seeds and grains that require crushing before they can be eaten. The appearance of such tools in archaeological sites indicates that people were investing effort in transforming plant materials into usable food. Similarly, stone implements used for cracking nuts or cutting plant fibers reveal how communities expanded their diets to include resources that were not immediately accessible. These technologies allowed people to extract nourishment from parts of the landscape that might otherwise remain unused. Environmental remains found at archaeological sites further deepen this picture. Layers of pollen, charcoal, and plant fragments preserved in soil can reveal the types of vegetation that once surrounded a settlement. When scientists compare these environmental records with the food remains left by humans, patterns sometimes emerge that suggest how communities responded to environmental changes. A decline in certain plant species, for example, might correspond with an increase in the use of alternative foods. Evidence of drought in sediment layers might coincide with signs that people expanded their hunting or gathering activities into new areas. These connections show that human diets often shifted in response to broader ecological conditions. It is important to remember that the archaeological record represents only fragments of the past. Many foods leave little trace after thousands of years, especially soft plant materials that decay quickly. Even so, the remains that do survive offer valuable hints about how early humans navigated the uncertainties of their environment. Instead of relying on a single dependable food supply, they drew nourishment from a wide network of plants and animals distributed across the landscape. This network functioned as a form of resilience, allowing communities to adjust when particular resources became scarce. Yet the need for such flexibility also reveals the instability of the system itself. If food sources had been consistently abundant and reliable, there would have been less reason for people to diversify their diets so widely. The evidence preserved in bones, hearths, and tools suggests the opposite. Human communities repeatedly adapted their food strategies as environmental conditions shifted around them. These adjustments are visible today in the layers of archaeological sites, where the remains of many different species tell a quiet story about how people responded to a world in which nourishment was never entirely predictable. When archaeologists compare many sites across different regions and time periods, a broader pattern begins to appear. Human diets in the deep past rarely depended on a single reliable resource. Instead, the remains left behind show repeated shifts in the types of foods people collected, hunted, or processed. At one layer of a site, the bones of larger animals might be common, suggesting that hunting opportunities were favorable during that time. In another layer, those large animals may become less frequent, while smaller species appear more often. Seeds, nuts, or plant fibers may also increase in the record. These transitions suggest that human communities were continually adjusting their strategies as environmental conditions changed around them. Such changes can occur gradually, or sometimes within relatively short spans of time. For example, an archaeological site used for many generations might show evidence that people initially relied heavily on one group of animals. Later layers might indicate that those animals became less available, while other food sources gained importance. These shifts do not necessarily mean that humans abandoned their earlier preferences. Rather, they reflect how people adapted when familiar resources became less dependable. When one source of nourishment declined, communities often widened their search to include additional plants and animals that had previously played smaller roles in the diet. Another revealing feature of archaeological evidence is the presence of what researchers sometimes call fallback foods. These are resources that may not be the most desirable or easiest to obtain but become important when preferred foods are scarce. Hard seeds that require grinding, fibrous plants that must be cooked carefully, or small animals that provide limited meat can all serve as fallback options. Their presence in archaeological layers suggests that human communities maintain knowledge of many different edible species, even those that were rarely used when other foods were plentiful. This knowledge acted as a form of ecological insurance, allowing people to respond when environmental conditions reduced access to more rewarding resources. The appearance of fallback foods in the archaeological record also highlights the delicate balance between effort and nourishment in ancient food systems. Some of these resources required considerable labor to gather or process. Digging roots from hard soil, cracking tough shells, or grinding seeds into edible forms demanded time and energy. Communities would likely invest such effort only when easier foods were limited. In this way, the presence of these labor-intensive foods can serve as an indirect signal that other resources were temporarily less available. Archaeological evidence also reveals how human communities sometimes changed their tools and techniques in response to these challenges. New types of implements appear in certain regions during periods when diets expanded to include more varied plant or animal foods. Grinding stones, digging tools, and specialized cutting implements reflect attempts to access resources that were not previously used as intensively. These technological adjustments suggest that early humans continually experimented with ways to broaden the range of foods they could obtain from the environment. Environmental records found alongside archaeological remains strengthen this interpretation. Changes in pollen deposits, charcoal layers, or sediment patterns sometimes indicate shifts in climate or vegetation. When these environmental changes align with alterations in the types of food remains found at human sites, they provide additional evidence that communities were responding directly to changes in their surroundings. A reduction in certain plant species might correspond with increased reliance on other edible plants. A change in animal populations might lead to different hunting strategies or the capture of alternative prey. These patterns demonstrate that early humans were not passive recipients of whatever the environment offered. They actively adjusted their behavior, tools, and knowledge to navigate the changing availability of food. Yet the very need for such constant adjustment reveals the underlying instability of the ancient food system. If resources had been consistently abundant and predictable, there would have been little reason for diets, tools, and gathering strategies to shift so frequently. Instead, the archaeological record repeatedly shows signs of adaptation to fluctuating conditions. Bones, plant remains, and tools together tell a quiet story about how often human communities had to rethink where nourishment might come from next. Within these layers of evidence lies a reminder that the search for food in human history was rarely straightforward. It required attention to changing landscapes, the willingness to use many different species, and the ability to adapt when familiar resources became scarce. The traces left behind in ancient soil do not describe a world where food was always plentiful. Instead, they reflect a long history of adjustment to environments where nourishment could shift quickly, leaving human communities to respond with creativity and resilience. For most of human history, people did not live in large populations spread across cities or villages. Instead, communities were small and widely dispersed across landscapes. Anthropological research and archaeological evidence suggest that many groups consisted of only a few dozen individuals who traveled and lived together. These small communities allowed people to move easily through their environments and respond to seasonal changes in food availability. Yet the same structure that provided flexibility also created a particular kind of vulnerability. When food resources became scarce in the surrounding landscape, there were often few nearby groups large enough to provide assistance. Each community depended heavily on its own ability to locate nourishment. Living in small groups shaped the way food was obtained and distributed. When hunters succeeded or gatherers discovered productive patches of plants, the resources were usually shared among members of the community. Sharing helped ensure that temporary successes benefited everyone and helped maintain cooperation within the group. In a small population, such cooperation was essential. A successful hunt might provide food for many people at once, while the absence of success for several days could affect everyone equally. The well-being of each individual was closely tied to the fortunes of the entire group. Small population size also meant that knowledge about food resources was limited to the experiences of those within the community. People passed down information about landscapes, seasonal patterns, and edible species through stories, observation, and direct teaching. This knowledge allowed groups to anticipate where certain foods might appear during different times of the year. However, even detailed understanding of the local environment could not guarantee that resources would always be present. If conditions changed in ways that reduced the availability of food in familiar territories, communities had to respond quickly, sometimes by traveling farther than usual to search for alternatives. Mobility was therefore one of the key strategies that supported survival in small populations. When resources declined in one area, a group could move toward regions where food was more abundant. Yet movement also involved uncertainty. The new landscape might be unfamiliar, and the expected resources might not appear exactly as anticipated. Travel required energy, and long journeys without reliable food along the way could place additional strain on the group. In this sense, mobility functioned as both a solution and a risk within the ancient food system. Another important consequence of small population size involved the sharing of labor. In many early human communities, different individuals contributed to the search for food in different ways. Some members might focus on hunting larger animals. Others might gather plants, collect insects, or search for shellfish along coastlines. Children and older members of the group often participated in lighter tasks, helping to locate edible plants or carry gathered foods back to camp. This division of activities increased the range of resources a community could access, reducing the likelihood that everyone depended on a single uncertain food source. Still, the effectiveness of this system depended on the productivity of the surrounding environment. If the landscape itself offered fewer resources during a particular season or year, the efforts of the group could yield less food despite their knowledge and cooperation. Small populations could not easily compensate by drawing on large stored reserves or by relying on distant trade networks. Their survival remained closely tied to the immediate ecological conditions around them. Archaeological findings sometimes suggest that human populations expanded or contracted in response to these environmental pressures. When landscapes supported abundant resources, communities could grow slightly larger or remain in the same area for longer periods. When resources declined, groups might split into smaller units or move away in search of more favorable conditions. These patterns indicate that human population size was often linked to the productivity of the environment. In times when food became harder to obtain, communities adapted by reducing pressure on local resources or exploring new territories. The small scale of early human populations therefore shaped the experience of hunger in subtle ways. In modern societies, large networks of people and institutions help distribute food across vast regions. Surpluses from one area can be transported to another where supplies are limited. For early humans living in small, mobile groups, such systems did not exist. Each community relied primarily on its own knowledge, cooperation, and the productivity of its environment. When food became scarce, the impact was felt directly and immediately by everyone within the group. The small size of early human communities also meant that the margin between balance and difficulty could be surprisingly narrow. When a group consisted of only a few dozen individuals, the food needed to sustain everyone might seem modest compared with the demands of modern populations. Yet in natural ecosystems where food was scattered and seasonal, even that modest requirement could be difficult to meet consistently. Each day, the group needed to obtain enough nourishment to maintain strength, support children who were growing, and allow adults to continue searching for more resources. If several days passed with limited success, the effects could begin to accumulate quickly. In small communities, the roles of individuals often overlapped. and each contribution mattered. Hunters might provide meat during successful pursuits, while gatherers returned with plants, roots, or insects collected from the surrounding landscape. Others might search for shellfish, dig edible tubers, or locate water sources that attracted animals. The diversity of these activities helped spread the risk across different kinds of resources. If one method of obtaining food failed, another might still succeed. This flexibility was one of the strengths of early human societies. However, the success of this system depended heavily on the productivity of the environment itself. When the landscape offered fewer resources, the efforts of the entire group might still produce limited results. The challenge becomes clearer when we consider how energy flows within such a community. Every person requires calories not only to survive, but also to perform the tasks necessary for obtaining food. A hunter who spends hours tracking animals needs energy to travel across the terrain. A gatherer digging for roots or carrying collected plants must also expend physical effort. When food becomes scarce, the body's reserves begin to decline, making these tasks more difficult. This creates a delicate cycle. The search for nourishment requires energy, yet the success of that search depends on the very resources that may already be limited. In larger populations, shortages in one area can sometimes be offset by the presence of others who have more food or by systems that redistribute resources. Early human communities rarely had such options. Neighboring groups existed, but they were often separated by large distances or by territories that each community relied upon for its own survival. Encounters between groups could lead to cooperation and exchange, yet they could also involve competition for limited resources. Because of this, a community experiencing scarcity could not always assume that help would be available nearby. Instead, groups often responded by adjusting their movement across the landscape. If the immediate area no longer provided enough nourishment, the community might travel toward regions where food was expected to be more abundant. This movement required knowledge of distant landscapes and confidence that resources might exist there. Sometimes such journeys led to new opportunities, especially if environmental conditions had improved in another region. At other times, the search itself might become difficult, particularly if the group encountered unfamiliar terrain or if the expected resources had also declined. Archaeological studies suggest that early human populations sometimes divided into smaller units during periods when food became harder to obtain. By splitting into separate groups, people could reduce pressure on local resources and explore wider territories. This strategy allowed the landscape more time to recover, while increasing the chances that at least some members of the broader community would find productive areas. Yet this approach also meant that individuals spent more time traveling and maintaining connections with relatives and allies across distances. The structure of small populations therefore influenced how hunger was experienced in the deep past. A temporary shortage of food could affect everyone within the group at once, because the resources that supported the community were drawn directly from the surrounding environment. Cooperation, knowledge, and movement helped reduce the risks created by this system, but they did not eliminate them. The survival of each community remained closely tied to the productivity of the land and waters around them. When those conditions shifted, even a well-organized group could suddenly find itself facing the challenge of locating enough nourishment to sustain everyone until the environment offered new opportunities again. The small scale of early human populations also influenced how knowledge about food was preserved and shared. In communities made up of only a few dozen individuals, ecological knowledge lived primarily in memory rather than in written records. Elders remembered where certain plants tended to grow, which valleys attracted animals during particular seasons, and how landscapes had changed during earlier years. Younger members learned by observing these patterns and participating in daily tasks such as gathering plants or following animal tracks. This system of learning created a deep familiarity with the surrounding environment, yet it also had limits. Knowledge could guide people toward likely sources of nourishment, but it could never guarantee that those sources would appear exactly as before. When environmental conditions shifted, even the most experienced individuals sometimes encountered landscapes that behaved differently from what they remembered. In such moments, small populations faced a unique challenge, because each community relied heavily on its own experience. Sudden environmental changes could disrupt expectations across the entire group. A place that had provided reliable plant harvests in previous seasons might yield little during an unusual year. A hunting route known for animal migrations might become quiet if herds altered their movement patterns. When these disruptions occurred, the knowledge passed down through generations still helped guide decisions, but it had to be adapted to new circumstances. Communities often responded by exploring unfamiliar areas, experimenting with different food sources, or adjusting the timing of their movements across the land. These adjustments required patience and cooperation, especially when resources were uncertain. Small populations also meant that each individual carried a portion of the group's collective experience. Hunters remembered animal behavior, gatherers recognized edible plants, and others knew where water sources appeared during dry seasons. The survival of the community depended on this shared understanding. When people worked together, combining their observations and memories, they increased the chances of locating food even when conditions were difficult. Yet if the surrounding environment changed quickly, the entire group might still struggle to find reliable nourishment. There were no distant institutions, stored reserves, or large networks of exchange to stabilize the situation. The response had to come from within the community itself. Mobility once again became an important tool for coping with these challenges. When a familiar territory no longer offered enough resources, groups could travel toward new regions in search of opportunity. Sometimes these journeys followed well-known seasonal routes that had been used for generations. At other times, communities may have ventured into areas that were less familiar, guided by environmental signals such as the presence of water, vegetation, or animal tracks. These explorations carried uncertainty, yet they also allowed humans to expand their understanding of the landscape over time. Each new area visited became part of a growing mental map of potential resources. Over many generations, this process gradually increased the geographical knowledge available to human populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that human groups occasionally reconnected with neighboring communities during such movements. Encounters between groups could lead to exchanges of information, tools, or even food. These interactions helped spread knowledge about distant landscapes and seasonal resources. However, such encounters were not guaranteed and could occur only occasionally depending on the distance between territories and the movement patterns of different communities. Most of the time, each group relied primarily on its own ability to interpret the environment and respond to change. The structure of small populations therefore shaped the human experience of uncertainty in a profound way. Knowledge, cooperation, and movement provided powerful tools for navigating a landscape where food could appear and disappear. Yet the scale of these communities meant that they remained closely connected to the immediate conditions of their surroundings. When environmental patterns shifted unexpectedly, the impact could reach everyone in the group at once. Early humans met these challenges with adaptability and shared experience, but the fragile relationship between people and food remained a constant feature of life across most of our species' history, across most of human history. Movement was not an occasional event, but a normal part of life. When food resources shifted across the landscape, people often followed those changes rather than remaining in one place. Mobility allowed human communities to respond to environmental variation in ways that stationary societies could not. If plants became scarce in one valley, another region might still offer edible resources. If animals migrated toward distant grasslands, hunters could attempt to follow their tracks across wider territories. In this sense, movement functioned as a practical strategy for managing the unpredictability of food. Yet mobility was never a simple solution. Traveling across the landscape required careful judgment about when and where to move. Every journey consumed energy, and energy was precisely what communities were trying to obtain through food. Deciding to leave a familiar territory therefore involved weighing potential benefits against the risks of uncertainty. The new area might contain abundant resources, but it might also prove less productive than expected. In the deep past, without maps or permanent roads, these decisions depended on memory, observation, and collective discussion within the group. Early humans likely learned to recognize environmental signals that suggested when movement might be necessary. A decline in the availability of plants or animals within a familiar territory could indicate that the landscape was entering a less productive period. Rivers that once held fish might yield fewer catches. The tracks of large animals might become rare along known hunting paths. When these signs appeared repeatedly, they could encourage communities to explore other areas where conditions might be different. The landscape itself provided hints about where such opportunities might exist. Distant hills, valleys, or coastlines could support ecosystems with different seasonal rhythms. By traveling between these environments, human groups attempted to maintain access to food throughout the year. Archaeological research provides evidence that many prehistoric communities followed regular movement patterns connected to seasonal resources. Certain campsites appear to have been used repeatedly during particular times of the year, suggesting that groups returned when nearby plants ripened or when animals migrated through the area. Other locations show signs of shorter visits, perhaps during periods when specific resources were briefly available. These patterns indicate that mobility often followed an ecological calendar, guiding people from one productive place to another as the seasons progressed. However, the success of such movements depended on timing. Arriving too early at a seasonal site might mean that plants had not yet matured or that animals had not yet arrived. Arriving too late could mean that the opportunity had already passed. Environmental variability added further uncertainty. Weather patterns could shift the timing of plant growth or animal migration from year to year. A community following the familiar rhythm of past seasons might discover that the expected resources had appeared earlier or later than usual. In these moments, mobility did not remove the risk of hunger. It simply changed the landscape in which that risk unfolded. Traveling itself required careful management of energy and supplies. During a journey, the group had to rely on whatever food could be obtained along the way. If the route crossed areas with limited resources, the movement could become physically demanding. Children, elders, and individuals carrying tools or gathered foods might slow the pace of travel. These practical considerations meant that decisions about movement involved the entire community. The group needed to balance the urgency of leaving a less productive territory with the physical demands of reaching a new one. Another aspect of mobility involved the knowledge of distant landscapes accumulated over generations. As communities moved across territories year after year, they gradually developed mental maps of rivers, forests, grasslands, and coastlines. These maps were not drawn on paper but preserved through memory and shared experience. People remembered where edible plants had been found in the past, or where animals had once gathered during particular seasons. This knowledge helped guide movement and increased the chances of encountering food in new locations. Yet even with such experience, the environment could still behave unpredictably. A valley that once supported abundant plants might suffer from drought. Animal herds might alter their migration routes in response to changes in vegetation. When such shifts occurred, communities had to adjust once again, sometimes traveling farther than expected in search of new opportunities. Mobility therefore represented both resilience and uncertainty in the human relationship with food. It allowed people to follow the shifting productivity of the natural world, but it also required constant decisions about when to stay and when to move. In a world where nourishment appeared unevenly across landscapes, the path toward the next meal was often a journey through changing terrain, guided by experience yet never fully certain of what awaited ahead. Movement across landscapes also changed the way early humans understood space and distance. For people living in mobile communities, the land was not divided into permanent borders but into a network of places that became useful at different times. A valley might be important during the season when certain plants ripened. A river corridor could become valuable when fish migrated upstream. A stretch of open grassland might support hunting when herds passed through. Each location had its moment within the yearly rhythm of the environment. Human groups learned to connect these places through travel, creating pathways that linked one food opportunity to another. Yet the success of these pathways depended on environmental stability that could never be fully guaranteed. When communities followed familiar routes from one region to the next, they often expected to encounter resources that had appeared in previous years. These expectations were built from long observation of seasonal patterns. Elders might remember how the land behaved during earlier cycles of rain and drought. Hunters might recall where animals had crossed rivers during migration. Gatherers might know which slopes received enough sunlight for certain plants to grow well. This accumulated knowledge helped guide movement, allowing communities to anticipate where food might appear along their journeys. However, the environment did not always repeat itself exactly. A season of unusual weather could alter the timing of plant growth or animal movement, creating unexpected gaps along the travel route. If a community reached a location expecting food that had not yet appeared, the delay could become a serious challenge. The group might need to wait longer than planned, search more widely in the surrounding area, or continue traveling in hopes of finding nourishment elsewhere. Each of these options required energy and careful decision-making. The unpredictability of such moments reminds us that mobility offered flexibility but not certainty. The path that had once connected several reliable food sources could suddenly become more difficult to follow if even one of those resources failed. Traveling across large territories also exposed communities to different ecological zones. A route might pass through forests, grasslands, riversides, and rocky highlands, each with its own set of plants and animals. This diversity increased the chances that food could be found somewhere along the way, but it also required broad ecological knowledge. People needed to recognize which plants were edible in each environment and understand the behavior of animals that inhabited different habitats. Over time, this experience expanded the range of resources human communities could use. Yet even a diverse landscape could present challenges if environmental conditions affected multiple regions at once. Extended droughts or colder periods could influence several ecosystems simultaneously, reducing food availability across a wide area. Another aspect of mobility involved encounters with other human groups. As communities moved through their territories, they sometimes crossed paths with neighboring populations. These encounters could lead to cooperation, exchange of knowledge, or sharing of resources. Information about distant landscapes might spread through such interactions, helping groups learn about new places where food could be found. At other times, however, encounters could involve competition, especially if several communities depended on the same limited resources. In these situations, mobility could help avoid conflict by allowing groups to shift their routes and explore alternative areas. The need to balance cooperation and independence added another layer of complexity to the movement patterns of early humans. Archaeological evidence from stone tools and campsite remains suggests that human populations gradually expanded their geographic range over tens of thousands of years. As groups moved across continents, they encountered new climates, unfamiliar plants, and animals that required different hunting strategies. Each new environment demanded learning and adaptation. Communities experimented with tools, techniques, and seasonal movements that allowed them to use the resources available in these unfamiliar landscapes. Through this process, human knowledge of the natural world slowly widened. Yet the expansion of territory did not remove the basic challenge of obtaining food. Even in new regions rich with unfamiliar species, the same patterns of abundance and scarcity continued to shape daily life. Resources appeared in certain places at certain times, and then faded again. Mobility allowed humans to follow these shifting opportunities across wider areas, but it did not transform the environment into a predictable provider of nourishment. The success of each journey still depended on timing, observation, and the hope that the next valley, river, or forest would offer the food that had become scarce behind them. Over long periods of time, the habit of moving across landscapes became deeply woven into the way human communities organized their lives. Travel routes connected places where food appeared during different seasons, forming patterns that could repeat year after year. These patterns were not fixed roads but remembered pathways shaped by experience. A group might leave a river valley after the fish migrations had ended and travel toward higher ground where plant foods would soon become available. Later in the year, they might continue toward forests where nuts or fruits matured before winter. Each step in this sequence was guided by knowledge of how the environment usually changed through the seasons. When these patterns worked as expected, mobility allowed communities to maintain a steady flow of nourishment by following the shifting productivity of the land. Yet the effectiveness of such movement depended on the delicate alignment of many environmental events. If the timing of even one part of the sequence changed, the entire journey could become more difficult. A plant harvest that normally appeared during a particular month might be delayed by unusual weather. Animals that once migrated through a valley might choose a different path after changes in vegetation or water availability. When such disruptions occurred, a community could arrive at a location expecting food and find only an empty landscape. Because the group had already left the previous resource behind, the gap between one opportunity and the next could suddenly widen. In those moments, the flexibility of mobility became both an advantage and a challenge. People could continue traveling in search of new resources, but the search itself required energy and time. The further a group moved without success, the more important the body's stored energy became. Internal reserves could support continued travel for a while, but they could not last indefinitely. The longer the search continued, the more carefully the community had to manage its remaining strength. Decisions about where to go next carried greater weight, because each choice could determine whether the next landscape would offer food or prolong the period of scarcity. Archaeological evidence suggests that such disruptions sometimes influenced the broader patterns of human settlement and migration. When environmental changes affected the productivity of familiar territories, groups may have traveled farther than usual in search of new opportunities. Over generations, these movements contributed to the gradual spread of humans into new regions. Some of these journeys likely began as responses to shifting food resources rather than deliberate attempts to explore distant lands. As communities moved beyond their traditional ranges, they encountered unfamiliar ecosystems that required new knowledge and adaptations. Even within these new environments, the same underlying reality remained. Food was still distributed unevenly across landscapes, appearing during certain seasons and disappearing during others. Mobility allowed humans to navigate these patterns, but it never guaranteed success. The environment still determined when and where nourishment could be found. In this sense, movement was less a solution than a continuous negotiation with the natural world. People followed signs of opportunity while accepting that those signs could change without warning. Another important aspect of mobility involved the sharing of knowledge across generations. Routes that connected seasonal resources were remembered and taught within communities. Younger members learned where certain plants grew, which rivers held fish during particular times, and which valleys offered shelter during colder seasons. These mental maps grew richer with experience, helping future travelers navigate the landscape more effectively. Yet even these carefully remembered pathways could lose their usefulness if environmental conditions shifted significantly. A drought might reduce the productivity of an area that had once been dependable. A new forest growth pattern might alter the habitats of animals that hunters relied upon. Such changes required communities to modify their routes and develop new patterns of movement. The story of human mobility therefore reveals both resilience and vulnerability. The ability to travel allowed people to adapt to changing conditions and explore new environments. At the same time, it shows how closely human survival remained tied to the rhythms of the natural world. Each journey across the land represented an attempt to stay connected to the shifting sources of nourishment that sustained life. In a world where food could appear suddenly in one place and vanish in another, movement became one of the most important ways humans responded to uncertainty. Yet every step forward also carried the quiet possibility that the next landscape might hold the answer to hunger or extend the search a little longer. For most of human history, the idea of storing large quantities of food for long periods did not exist in the way it does today. Modern societies rely on storage systems that protect food from spoilage for months or even years. Refrigeration, sealed containers, and large storage buildings allow communities to accumulate reserves that can be distributed gradually over time. In the deep past, such systems were limited or entirely absent. Food was usually eaten soon after it was gathered, hunted, or collected from the landscape. This pattern shaped the rhythm of daily life, linking survival closely to the resources available at that particular moment. Many foods obtained in natural environments do not remain edible for long without special preparation. Fresh meat spoils quickly if it is not dried, smoked, or preserved in some other way. Fruits and leafy plants often lose their nutritional value soon after being harvested. Even roots and seeds that can last longer require careful protection from moisture, insects, and animals. Early human communities sometimes developed techniques to extend the life of certain foods. Drying meat in the sun, smoking fish over fire, or storing nuts in sheltered locations could help preserve nourishment for later use. However, these methods often depended on environmental conditions and did not always guarantee long-term storage. In many climates, especially warm or humid ones, food could deteriorate quickly despite careful effort. Because of these limitations, daily survival often depended on the success of recent foraging or hunting. A successful hunt might provide enough meat for several days if the group could preserve part of it, but eventually the supply would run out. Plant foods gathered during one part of the season might last only a short time before spoiling or being consumed. Without reliable methods for storing large surpluses, communities had to remain attentive to the continual search for new sources of nourishment. This constant engagement with the environment shaped the way people organized their time and movement. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities created temporary storage methods when conditions allowed. In cooler climates, frozen ground or naturally cold caves could help preserve food for longer periods. In drier environments, certain seeds or grains could remain usable if stored carefully. Some groups may have cached foods in hidden locations to protect them from animals or rival communities. These strategies offered valuable support during periods when fresh resources were temporarily scarce. Yet even these forms of storage were limited in scale and duration. They could help bridge short gaps in food availability, but they rarely provided security for entire seasons or years. The absence of extensive storage systems meant that human survival remained closely connected to the immediate landscape. Each day brought new opportunities to gather plants, hunt animals, or collect other edible resources. At the same time, each day also carried the possibility that these opportunities might be fewer than expected. When a hunt failed or a gathering area produced less food than usual, communities could not simply rely on large reserves accumulated earlier. Instead, they needed to continue searching for nourishment within the environment around them. This dependence on fresh resources also influenced social practices within communities. Sharing food became an important way of balancing temporary successes and failures. When hunters obtained a large animal, the meat could be distributed among many members of the group, helping ensure that everyone benefited from the rare moment of abundance. On days when hunting or gathering yielded little, the memory of earlier sharing strengthened cooperation within the community. Such practices helped maintain social stability in a system where food availability changed frequently. Even with these cooperative strategies, the underlying challenge remained. The natural world rarely produced food in perfectly consistent quantities. A productive season might be followed by a less generous one. A landscape rich in edible plants one year might yield fewer the next if weather patterns changed. Without the ability to accumulate large and reliable reserves, early human communities had to navigate these fluctuations as they occurred. Their survival depended on the ongoing interaction between human effort and environmental opportunity. The absence of long-term storage did not mean that people lived without planning or foresight. On the contrary, they paid careful attention to seasonal rhythms and environmental signals that indicated where food might appear next. Knowledge of plant growth cycles, animal migrations, and changing weather patterns helped guide decisions about when to move and where to search. Yet even with this understanding, the supply of food remained tied to conditions that humans could not fully control. Within that uncertainty lay one of the quiet truths of our species' long past. For most of human history, nourishment was something that had to be found again and again, because the systems needed to store it for long periods had not yet emerged. Even when early humans attempted to store food, the scale of those efforts remained relatively small compared with the storage systems that exist today. The techniques available to prehistoric communities could slow the process of spoilage, but rarely stop it completely. Drying meat in open air removed moisture and helped prevent rapid decay, yet the preserved meat still needed protection from insects, humidity, and animals. Smoking food over a fire could extend its usable life, but maintaining the correct conditions required careful attention and time. These methods were valuable, yet they depended heavily on environmental factors such as dry weather, suitable temperatures, and access to fuel for fires. If these conditions changed unexpectedly, stored food could deteriorate faster than planned. Plant foods presented different challenges. Some seeds and nuts could remain edible for longer periods, especially if they were kept in dry shelters or buried in cool soil. However, these resources were often seasonal and available only during certain parts of the year. Once collected, they had to be protected from moisture and from animals that were equally interested in the stored supply. Rodents and insects could quickly reduce a carefully gathered cache if it was not well hidden or protected. In humid climates, mold could damage plant foods even when they were stored carefully. These risks meant that early storage methods often provided only temporary security rather than long-term stability. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities developed creative ways to protect food for short periods. In colder regions, natural freezing conditions could preserve meat or fish for extended stretches of time during winter months. In certain landscapes, people used pits dug into the ground where temperatures remained relatively stable. Foods placed inside these pits might remain edible longer than if they were left exposed. Yet even these techniques depended on local environmental conditions and were rarely capable of preserving food for many months beyond the season when it was collected. The limits of storage meant that the balance between abundance and scarcity could change quickly. When hunters successfully captured a large animal, the group might experience a brief moment of plenty. Meat could be shared, cooked, and perhaps preserved for several days. But as time passed, that supply gradually diminished. If the next hunting attempt was unsuccessful, the gap between available food and the group's needs could widen. Without extensive reserves, communities often returned to the landscape to search for new resources before the previous supply had completely disappeared. This rhythm shaped the pace of daily life. People remained attentive to opportunities for gathering plants, locating animals, or exploring areas where edible foods might appear. The absence of large storage systems also meant that communities could not easily accumulate food during productive seasons, in order to guarantee comfort during less productive ones. Instead, each season required its own strategies. During periods when plants or animals were abundant, people might gather and share more food than they needed immediately. Yet the ability to carry and protect that surplus remained limited. Travel itself imposed constraints, because stored food had to be transported as communities moved across the landscape. Carrying large quantities could slow movement and increase the physical burden on individuals already responsible for tools, children, and other necessities. Because of these practical limits, early human groups often relied on a different form of security. Rather than storing large quantities of food, they stored knowledge. Communities learned which areas produced certain plants, when animals were likely to migrate, and how landscapes changed throughout the year. This understanding of seasonal patterns allowed people to move toward new sources of nourishment as older ones faded. Knowledge of the environment functioned as a kind of living reserve, guiding communities from one opportunity to the next. Still, this knowledge could not eliminate uncertainty. Weather patterns sometimes altered the timing of plant growth or the movement of animals. Rivers might flood or dry unexpectedly. When these changes occurred, even well-informed communities could find themselves facing temporary shortages. The limited ability to store food meant that such disruptions had immediate consequences. Without a large supply to draw upon, people needed to adapt quickly, searching for new resources or moving toward landscapes that offered better conditions. Through this continuous interaction with the environment, early humans developed remarkable flexibility in the ways they obtained nourishment. Yet the underlying structure of their food system remained fragile. Abundance could appear suddenly when conditions were favorable, but it could also fade quickly once those conditions shifted. In a world without extensive storage, the line between having enough to eat and needing to search again was often very thin. The limitations of food storage also influenced how people thought about abundance when it appeared. In many natural environments, food does not arrive gradually in equal amounts throughout the year. Instead, certain resources appear suddenly during short windows of time. Fruits may ripen all at once on a group of trees. Fish may gather in large numbers during a seasonal migration. Animals may pass through a region briefly while following grazing routes. When these moments occurred, human communities often encountered more food than they could immediately consume. Yet the inability to preserve large quantities meant that these moments of abundance were temporary by nature. The community could eat well for a short time, share the surplus among its members, and perhaps preserve a small portion, but the opportunity would soon pass. This pattern created a rhythm in which brief periods of plenty alternated with longer periods of careful searching. During productive moments, people gathered, hunted, and prepared as much food as possible, knowing that the supply would not last indefinitely. Cooperation became especially important during these times. When a large animal was hunted or when plants produced an unusually rich harvest, the food was often distributed widely among the group. Sharing helped ensure that the benefits of abundance reached everyone and reduced the risk that some members would go without nourishment, while others had more than they could use. Such practices also strengthened social bonds that could support the group during less productive periods. Archaeological evidence from ancient camps sometimes shows signs of these temporary surpluses. Large numbers of animal bones in a single layer may indicate that a successful hunt occurred and that the meat was processed and consumed by the community. In other cases, concentrations of plant remains suggest that people gathered and prepared seasonal foods in large quantities during short harvesting periods. These findings reveal that early humans recognized opportunities for abundance and responded by making the most of them. However, the archaeological record also shows that these episodes were rarely permanent. After the seasonal event passed, the landscape returned to its usual pattern in which food was scattered and required effort to obtain. The transition from abundance to scarcity could happen quickly. A river filled with fish during one week might appear nearly empty the next once the migration moved onward. A grove of fruit trees might offer plentiful harvests for only a brief portion of the season before the remaining fruit spoiled or was consumed by animals. Because long-term preservation remained limited, these shifts directly affected the availability of food for human communities. When the temporary surplus disappeared, the search for nourishment resumed with the same uncertainty that existed before. This cycle shaped the strategies people used to navigate their environment. Knowledge of seasonal events allowed communities to anticipate when certain foods would appear. Groups might travel long distances to reach areas known for particular harvests or migrations. Arriving at the right moment could provide valuable nourishment and strengthen the group before more challenging periods. Yet the success of such journeys depended on timing and environmental conditions that humans could not fully control. If a seasonal resource appeared earlier or later than expected, the opportunity might be missed entirely. The limited ability to store food also influenced how communities balanced consumption and restraint. During times of abundance, people could eat well and replenish the body's energy reserves. These internal reserves played an important role in bridging the gaps between productive periods. The human body can store energy in forms that allow it to function when food is temporarily scarce. Yet these reserves are finite. If the next opportunity for nourishment did not arrive soon enough, the body's stored energy would gradually decline. In this way, the cycles of abundance and scarcity were not only environmental patterns but also biological experiences. Within this rhythm lies an important insight about the long relationship between humans and food. The natural world often provided nourishment in bursts rather than steady streams. Human communities adapted by sharing resources, traveling to seasonal harvests, and developing knowledge of the landscape. Even so, the limits of preservation meant that abundance could never be fully captured for the future. Each season brought new opportunities, but it also carried the quiet reminder that the food available today might not remain available tomorrow. For most of human history, the human body itself functioned as one of the most reliable forms of food storage available. Unlike modern systems that store nourishment in containers or warehouses, early humans relied largely on biological processes within their own bodies to manage the uncertainty of food availability. When food was plentiful, the body converted excess energy into stored reserves. When food became scarce, those reserves could be gradually used to sustain essential functions. This ability allowed humans to survive temporary gaps between successful hunts or productive gathering periods. It did not eliminate the risk of hunger, but it provided a buffer that made short interruptions in food supply more manageable. The biological system responsible for this buffering evolved long before agriculture or permanent settlements existed. For hundreds of thousands of years, human ancestors lived in environments where the appearance of food was irregular. Some days might provide abundant nourishment through successful hunting or gathering, while other days might offer little. In such conditions, the ability to store energy within the body would have offered a clear survival advantage. Individuals capable of maintaining energy reserves during times of abundance could continue searching for food during lean periods, increasing their chances of surviving until the environment provided new opportunities. This biological strategy is visible in several aspects of human physiology. The human body can convert surplus calories into fat, storing energy that can later be released when food intake decreases. Fat tissue functions as a form of long-term energy storage, supporting vital organs and maintaining body functions when external nourishment is temporarily unavailable. This system operates quietly within the body, adjusting continuously as food intake rises or falls. When people consume more energy than they immediately require, the body gradually increases its reserves. When intake declines, those reserves are slowly used to maintain stability. From an evolutionary perspective, this capacity helped humans navigate environments where food availability fluctuated across days, weeks, or seasons. The importance of these internal reserves becomes clearer when we consider the physical demands of obtaining food in natural landscapes. Hunting, gathering, and traveling across varied terrain all require energy. During periods when food was difficult to obtain, individuals still needed the strength to continue these activities. Energy stored within the body could support these efforts temporarily, allowing people to remain active while searching for new resources. Without such reserves, even short interruptions in food supply could have made sustained movement and exploration much more difficult. However, the body's ability to store energy has natural limits. Internal reserves can support survival only for a certain period before they begin to decline significantly. If the search for food extends too long without success, the body gradually reduces energy expenditure, and physical performance may weaken. In this way, biological storage functions as a temporary bridge rather than a permanent solution. It allows humans to endure short gaps in nourishment, but it cannot replace the need to eventually locate new sources of food in the environment. Anthropological observations of traditional foraging societies illustrate how this balance between internal reserves and environmental resources can operate. Periods of relative abundance may allow individuals to regain strength and restore their energy stores. Later, when hunting success declines or certain plants are less available, those reserves can help sustain the community while new strategies are explored. This pattern reflects a long-standing interaction between the human body and the ecosystems that surround it. The body provides resilience during temporary shortages, while the environment ultimately determines when and where new nourishment becomes available. The presence of this biological buffering system reveals something important about the conditions under which human evolution took place. If food had always been consistently abundant and predictable, the strong capacity for storing energy within the body might not have been as advantageous. Instead, the development of these metabolic mechanisms suggests that fluctuations in food availability were common enough to shape the physiology of our species. Over many generations, individuals whose bodies could effectively store and release energy during periods of scarcity would have been better equipped to survive and pass on their traits. Yet even this powerful adaptation could not fully remove the uncertainty that surrounded food in the natural world. Internal reserves could extend survival for a time, but they could not produce nourishment on their own. Ultimately, the continuation of life still depended on the landscape, providing new opportunities for gathering plants, hunting animals, or discovering other edible resources. The human body therefore became part of a larger system in which biological storage and environmental productivity worked together, each helping to bridge the gaps left by the other. The presence of internal energy reserves also influenced how humans experienced the passage of time during periods when food was difficult to obtain. When nourishment was temporarily scarce, the body did not immediately stop functioning. Instead, it gradually shifted the way energy was used. The body can reduce certain non-essential activities and rely more heavily on stored energy to maintain vital processes such as breathing, circulation, and basic movement. This gradual adjustment allowed early humans to continue searching for food, even after several days with limited intake. Without such a mechanism, short interruptions in food availability could have rapidly threatened survival. In natural environments where hunting and gathering often produced uneven results, this ability provided a crucial form of resilience. The use of stored energy does not occur in isolation. It interacts closely with behavior and decision-making. When food becomes harder to find, human communities may begin to change how they move through the landscape or how they allocate their time and effort. Instead of investing energy in long pursuits that might not succeed, people might focus more on reliable but smaller food sources such as plants, insects, or shellfish. These adjustments allow the community to conserve energy while still obtaining nourishment. Internal reserves provide the temporary support needed to make such transitions possible. They create a window of time during which new strategies can be attempted. However, this window is not unlimited. The body's energy reserves decline steadily if food intake remains low. As these reserves decrease, physical strength and endurance can gradually weaken. Activities that once required modest effort may begin to feel more demanding. For communities dependent on physical labor to obtain food, this change could influence daily decisions. Hunters might shorten their search areas. Gatherers might concentrate on nearby resources rather than traveling long distances. These adjustments reflect the close connection between biological energy levels and the strategies used to obtain food from the environment. Another aspect of internal energy storage involves the body's capacity to recover when nourishment becomes available again. After a successful hunt or a productive period of gathering, people can restore the energy that was used during earlier shortages. The body gradually rebuilds its reserves, preparing once more for the possibility that food might again become difficult to obtain. This cycle of depletion and restoration mirrors the broader rhythms of the natural world. Just as ecosystems experience periods of growth and decline, the human body adjusts its internal balance in response to the changing availability of resources. Anthropological studies of traditional foraging populations illustrate how this pattern can unfold over time. Periods when food is plentiful often coincide with greater physical activity and stronger energy reserves within the community. During less productive seasons, people may rely more heavily on their internal stores while adjusting their activities to conserve effort. These patterns show that biological storage does not function as a replacement for environmental resources, but as a temporary support system that allows human communities to endure fluctuations in food availability. The ability to store energy within the body also helped humans explore new environments. When groups traveled across unfamiliar landscapes, they could not always predict when the next reliable food source would appear. Internal reserves allowed individuals to continue moving and searching even when the immediate surroundings offered little nourishment. This capability likely played an important role in the long journeys through which human populations gradually spread into new regions of the world. Without some capacity to withstand temporary scarcity, such movements across challenging environments would have been much more difficult. Yet the presence of internal reserves did not remove the fundamental uncertainty surrounding food in the natural world. Biological storage can support survival for a limited time, but it cannot create new nourishment. If environmental conditions fail to provide new resources before reserves are depleted, the body's protective buffer eventually reaches its limits. The effectiveness of this adaptation therefore depends on the continual interaction between human physiology and the ecosystems that supply food. Through this interaction, the human body became an important partner in the long search for nourishment. It helped bridge the intervals when the landscape offered little, allowing communities to continue moving, observing, and adapting. But even the most resilient biological systems remained connected to the larger cycles of the environment, where the next opportunity for nourishment always depended on forces beyond human control. Over long stretches of time, the interaction between the human body and fluctuating food availability shaped many subtle aspects of human behavior. The ability to store energy internally did not remove the uncertainty of obtaining food, but it allowed communities to remain active and responsive during difficult periods. Because the body could temporarily support survival through stored energy, people could continue exploring the landscape, testing new strategies, and adapting their movements rather than becoming immobilized by short-term shortages. This biological flexibility worked together with cultural knowledge and cooperation to create a system that could withstand occasional interruptions in nourishment. When food became scarce, communities often shifted their attention toward resources that were more dependable, even if they provided smaller amounts of energy. In many natural environments, large animals might appear only occasionally, while smaller resources such as plants, insects, or shellfish could be found more consistently. During times when major hunting efforts were unsuccessful, groups might spend more time gathering these alternative foods. The internal energy reserves of the body allowed individuals to remain patient while searching for these resources, even when the immediate rewards were modest. Over generations, this pattern likely reinforced a flexible approach to diet in which communities used a wide variety of plants and animals to sustain themselves. The body's capacity to store energy also interacted with social cooperation. When a community experienced a successful hunt or gathered an unusually rich supply of plant foods, the shared meal not only satisfied immediate hunger, but also helped rebuild the energy reserves of many individuals at once. This collective recovery strengthened the group's ability to continue traveling, searching, and adapting when conditions later became more difficult. In this way, biological storage and social sharing complemented one another. Internal reserves allowed individuals to endure temporary shortages, while cooperative distribution of food helped restore those reserves across the entire community when abundance appeared. Anthropologists often observe that traditional foraging societies maintained strong traditions of sharing food among members of the group. Such practices can help reduce the effects of unpredictable success in hunting or gathering. When one person or small group obtains more food than they can consume alone, Distributing that food ensures that the entire community benefits from the moment of abundance. Over time, this practice creates a social system in which individuals rely on one another as much as they rely on their own efforts. Biological reserves make this system more stable by allowing people to endure the intervals between successful food acquisitions. Yet even the combined strength of biological storage and social cooperation did not fully remove the fragility of ancient food systems. The reserves within the body eventually diminish if food remains scarce for too long. Similarly, the benefits of sharing depend on at least occasional success in obtaining food from the environment. If environmental conditions reduce the availability of plants and animals across a wide region, both biological and social buffers may gradually weaken. These limits remind us that the ultimate source of nourishment remained the ecosystem surrounding human communities. The human body evolved to manage short-term uncertainty, but it could not replace the productivity of the land and waters that provided food. Over the long arc of human history, this relationship between biology and environment formed a delicate balance. The body stored energy, the community shared resources, and knowledge guided movement across landscapes. Together, these elements allowed humans to survive in environments where food appeared irregularly. At the same time, each element depended on the others. Biological reserves required eventual replenishment. Social sharing required occasional success in hunting or gathering. Environmental knowledge required landscapes that still contained edible resources. Within this interconnected system, the search for food remained an ongoing process rather than a problem solved once and for all. The human body provided resilience, but it did not remove the deeper reality that nourishment depended on forces outside the body itself. In this way, biological storage helped humans endure the changing rhythms of the natural world, while quietly reflecting the long evolutionary history of a species shaped by environments where food could appear suddenly, disappear just as quickly, and require constant attention to the shifting opportunities of the landscape. For most of human history, the relationship between people and food was shaped by forces far larger than any individual community. Weather patterns, seasonal changes, and longer cycles in climate influenced how plants grew and how animals moved across landscapes. These environmental processes operated on scales that humans could observe but rarely control. Communities learned to recognize certain signals within the landscape, such as the arrival of rains that encouraged plant growth or the cooling temperatures that influenced animal migration. Yet even with careful observation, the exact timing and intensity of these patterns often varied from year to year. A season that once brought reliable nourishment might behave differently the next time it returned. This variability created an underlying uncertainty that influenced how food appeared across the natural world. One of the most important environmental influences involved the seasonal rhythm of ecosystems. In many regions, plants produce edible fruits, seeds, or roots during particular months when conditions are favorable. Animals also respond to these cycles, moving between habitats as vegetation and water availability change throughout the year. Human communities living within these environments learned to follow these rhythms closely. Certain places became associated with particular seasons because they offered reliable food at predictable times. A valley might provide abundant plants after seasonal rains, while a river could support fishing when migratory species returned. By paying attention to these patterns, people could align their movements with the natural calendar of the landscape. However, seasonal cycles rarely repeat with perfect precision. Weather patterns can shift the timing of rainfall or alter the temperatures that influence plant growth. A delay in seasonal rains might postpone the appearance of edible plants. An unusually cold or warm period might change the behavior of animals that communities depended upon for hunting. These variations could disrupt expectations built from earlier years of observation. When this happened, communities might arrive at familiar gathering areas only to discover that the resources they expected had not yet appeared or had already passed. Such disruptions remind us that human knowledge of the environment, while valuable, was always shaped by conditions that remained partly unpredictable. Beyond the rhythm of individual seasons, longer environmental changes also influence food availability across generations. Archaeological and environmental records show that landscapes have experienced shifts in vegetation and climate over thousands of years. Forests may expand or retreat, grasslands may grow or shrink, and rivers may alter their courses. These gradual changes affect the distribution of plants and animals that humans rely upon for nourishment. Communities living within these landscapes had to adapt to these transformations, sometimes by adjusting their movement patterns or exploring new regions where resources were more abundant. These long-term changes did not happen overnight, but they could still reshape the opportunities available for obtaining food over the span of several generations. Environmental disturbances could also influence food supplies more suddenly. Storms, floods, or droughts sometimes affected local ecosystems in ways that reduced the availability of plants and animals for a period of time. A flood might damage plant growth in a valley that had previously supported gathering. A drought might reduce the water sources that attract animals, making hunting more difficult. Such events could temporarily disrupt the balance between human communities and the landscapes they depended upon. When this occurred, people often responded by adjusting their activities, traveling to other areas, or focusing on different food sources that remained available. These responses illustrate the adaptability that characterized human survival in natural environments. Yet the need for such adaptation also highlights the fragile nature of food availability throughout much of human history. Unlike modern agricultural systems that attempt to stabilize food production through technology and infrastructure, early humans depended directly on ecosystems that followed their own rhythms. The success of gathering or hunting often reflected conditions that had developed weeks or months earlier through patterns of rain, temperature, and plant growth. When these patterns shifted unexpectedly, the availability of nourishment could change quickly as well. Within this larger environmental framework, human communities navigated their search for food with patience and awareness. Knowledge of seasonal rhythms helped guide movement and planning, but it never removed uncertainty entirely. The natural world remained dynamic, constantly shaping where and when nourishment appeared. In this sense, the human experience of food throughout most of history was inseparable from the broader environmental processes that governed life on the landscape. Environmental changes also influence food availability through the delicate relationships that connect plants, animals, water, and climate. In natural ecosystems, each element depends on the others. Plants rely on rainfall, soil conditions, and sunlight to grow. Animals depend on plants or other animals for nourishment. Rivers and wetlands provide water that supports both vegetation and wildlife. When one part of this system changes, the effects often spread through the rest of the environment. For human communities who depended directly on these ecosystems, such changes could quietly reshape the availability of food in ways that were not always immediately visible. For example, a period of reduced rainfall might first affect the growth of certain plants. At the beginning, this change could appear subtle, perhaps producing smaller harvests of edible leaves or fruits. Over time, however, the effects might extend further. Animals that relied on those plants could begin moving toward regions where vegetation remained more abundant. As these animals changed their movement patterns, hunting opportunities for human communities could also shift. In this way, a single environmental change might gradually influence several parts of the food system, eventually affecting both gathering and hunting activities. These interconnected processes demonstrate how closely human nourishment was linked to the broader health of ecosystems. Even small environmental variations could alter the balance between different food sources available to a community. A wet season might encourage the growth of certain plants while reducing the presence of animals that prefer drier landscapes. A colder period might slow plant growth but increase opportunities to hunt species adapted to cooler climates. Human communities learned to observe these patterns and adjust their activities accordingly, but they could not fully prevent the changes themselves. The landscape continued to evolve through forces that operated far beyond the scale of individual communities. Another example of ecological interconnection can be seen in the relationship between water sources and animal populations. Rivers, lakes, and seasonal wetlands often attract a wide variety of wildlife. When water is plentiful, these areas can support large numbers of animals and plants, creating opportunities for human communities to gather food or hunt. If water levels decline due to drought or changes in rainfall patterns, animals may disperse across wider territories in search of new sources. This movement can make hunting less predictable, as animals no longer gather in the same places where they once did. At the same time, plant species that depend on moisture may become less abundant, reducing the availability of edible vegetation in nearby areas. These examples illustrate how environmental conditions could influence multiple food sources simultaneously. Archaeological research sometimes reveals evidence of such shifts in ancient ecosystems. Changes in pollen preserved within soil layers can indicate how vegetation patterns altered over time. Animal remains found at archaeological sites may show that certain species became more or less common during particular periods. When scientists compare these records with evidence of human activity, they often see signs that communities responded to these environmental changes by adjusting their diets or movement patterns. This ability to adapt reflects an important aspect of human survival in natural landscapes. Rather than relying on a single food source, people often used a wide range of plants and animals, allowing them to respond when environmental conditions affected one resource more than others. Yet even with this flexibility, the availability of food remained connected to ecological processes that humans could only observe, not control. A landscape that supported abundant food during one generation might become less productive during another due to gradual shifts in vegetation or climate. Communities living in these environments had to remain attentive to the signals that indicated such changes. Over time, this attentiveness contributed to a deep familiarity with the rhythms of the natural world. People learned to read the landscape through subtle signs such as the appearance of certain plants, the behavior of animals, or the flow of water through valleys and rivers. This knowledge helped guide decisions about where to gather food or when to travel toward new areas. However, even the most careful observation could not eliminate the uncertainty created by environmental change. Ecosystems continued to evolve through processes that unfolded across seasons, years, and generations. As these processes reshaped the distribution of plants and animals, human communities once again adjusted their strategies, searching for nourishment within landscapes that were always quietly in motion. Over long periods of time, the shifting conditions of the natural world created a landscape in which food could never be assumed to remain constant. Plants, animals, and water sources responded continuously to changes in climate, vegetation, and geography. Some changes occurred slowly across many generations, while others appeared suddenly within a single season. For human communities living within these environments, the availability of food depended on how these many factors aligned at a given moment. When rainfall arrived at the right time, plants could grow abundantly, attracting animals and providing gathering opportunities. When temperatures remained stable and water sources were reliable, ecosystems could support a wide range of edible species. Yet when these conditions shifted, even slightly, the balance that sustained human nourishment could change as well. One important aspect of these environmental patterns is that they often affected multiple food sources simultaneously. A dry season, for example, might reduce the growth of plants that people gathered, while also influencing the movement of animals that relied on the same vegetation. Rivers that normally supported fish populations might shrink or become warmer, affecting aquatic life. When several of these changes occurred together, the variety of food available to human communities could decline at the same time. In such situations, the strategies people used to cope with scarcity became especially important. Communities might travel farther in search of more favorable landscapes, shift their diets toward alternative resources, or adjust the timing of their movements to match new environmental rhythms. Archaeological and environmental records show that such adjustments occurred repeatedly throughout human history. Changes in the types of animal bones found at ancient campsites sometimes indicate that hunters began targeting different species as environmental conditions evolved. Plant remains preserved in sediments reveal shifts in vegetation that likely influence gathering practices. These patterns suggest that human communities continually monitored their surroundings and adapted their behavior in response to ecological signals. The presence of these adaptations demonstrates the remarkable flexibility that humans developed while living within dynamic ecosystems. However, flexibility did not remove the underlying uncertainty. Even when communities successfully adapted to one set of environmental conditions, new changes could emerge later. A region that supported a diverse range of plants during one period might gradually transform into a landscape with fewer edible species. Animal populations could expand during favorable years and decline during others. These fluctuations created a world in which the search for food required ongoing attention and awareness. Each generation inherited knowledge about how the environment had behaved in the past, but they also had to interpret the conditions unfolding in their own time. Environmental variability also influenced the spatial distribution of food across the landscape. Certain areas might remain productive even when surrounding regions experienced difficulty. Valleys with reliable water sources, Coastal environments rich in marine life, or forests with diverse plant species could sometimes provide refuge during challenging periods. Human communities often learned to recognize these more stable environments and return to them when other areas became less productive. Yet reaching such locations might involve traveling long distances, and there was never a guarantee that the conditions there would remain unchanged. The stability of one region could also shift if climate patterns altered the ecosystems that supported its resources. These realities highlight the dynamic relationship between humans and the landscapes they inhabited. Early human survival depended not on controlling nature but on responding to it with observation, cooperation, and movement. The availability of food emerged from the complex interaction of weather, vegetation, animal behavior, and geography. Human communities learned to navigate this complexity by paying attention to subtle environmental cues and adjusting their strategies accordingly. Even so, the environment remained capable of surprising them with unexpected changes. In this way, the long human experience with food was shaped by forces that extended far beyond individual effort. The ecosystems that supported nourishment were constantly evolving, guided by natural processes that unfolded across seasons and centuries. Within that ever-changing world, people searched for plants to gather, animals to hunt, and waters that held fish. Their knowledge and adaptability helped them endure many challenges, yet the environment always retained the ability to alter the conditions under which food could be found. This quiet uncertainty formed part of the background of human life for most of our species' history, reminding communities that nourishment depended on landscapes whose rhythms were always shifting. For most of human history, the search for food was not simply a matter of finding something edible. It involved navigating a complex system in which many different factors interacted at once. The landscape offered plants that grew during particular seasons, animals that moved across territories according to changing conditions, and water sources that supported life in certain places but not others. Human communities learned to move within this system by observing patterns, sharing knowledge, and adapting their behavior to what the environment provided. Over thousands of generations, this interaction shaped the relationship between human survival and the rhythms of the natural world. Food was rarely guaranteed, but people developed ways to respond when its availability changed. One of the most important aspects of this system was the balance between predictability and uncertainty. Certain patterns in the environment could be observed repeatedly. Plants often ripened during similar times each year. Animals followed migration routes that tended to pass through familiar landscapes. Seasonal rains encouraged vegetation growth in regions where water was usually scarce. These repeating events allowed communities to anticipate when and where food might appear. Knowledge of such patterns was carefully preserved and passed from one generation to the next, forming a foundation for decisions about travel, gathering, and hunting. Yet alongside these predictable rhythms existed a layer of unpredictability that could never be fully removed. Weather patterns sometimes shifted unexpectedly, altering the timing of plant growth or animal movement. Rivers might change their course or flood valleys that once provided gathering grounds. Long-term environmental changes could gradually transform entire landscapes, influencing which species of plants and animals were present. Because human communities depended directly on these ecosystems, even subtle variations could influence the availability of nourishment. The strategies developed by early humans reflected an ongoing effort to manage this uncertainty. Communities moved across territories to follow seasonal resources, shared food within their groups to reduce the effects of temporary shortages, and used their body's ability to store energy to endure periods when food was difficult to obtain. They also developed tools that allowed them to access a wider range of edible resources, from grinding stones used to process seeds to digging implements that uncovered roots hidden beneath the soil. Each of these strategies expanded the ways people could interact with their environment, increasing their chances of finding nourishment in changing conditions. At the same time, these adaptations reveal how closely human survival remained tied to the natural world. None of these strategies created food independently of the environment. Movement allowed communities to follow resources, but it depended on those resources existing somewhere within the landscape. Sharing redistributed food within the group, but it required that someone had obtained nourishment to share in the first place. Biological energy reserves allowed people to endure temporary shortages, but those reserves eventually needed to be replenished through new sources of food. Each strategy functioned as part of a broader system in which humans and ecosystems were deeply connected. Archaeological evidence from many parts of the world illustrates this long relationship between people and their environments. Campsites appear in locations where plants, animals, and water sources once converged to support human activity. Stone tools show signs of use in hunting, processing plants, or preparing animal products. Layers of soil preserve traces of ancient vegetation and animal populations that once formed the foundation of human diets. Together, these remains reveal a story of adaptation in which communities responded repeatedly to shifting ecological conditions. Over time, these responses allowed humans to inhabit a wide variety of environments, from forests and grasslands to deserts and coastal regions. Yet even as human populations expanded across the planet, the underlying pattern remained consistent. Food appeared in particular places and times according to the dynamics of local ecosystems. People observed these patterns, adjusted their movements and practices, and relied on cooperation and knowledge to navigate the challenges that emerged. This system did not eliminate hunger entirely, but it allowed human communities to persist within landscapes where nourishment could change from one season to the next. In this way, the long human relationship with food reflects a broader truth about our species. Humans evolved within environments that required flexibility, patience, and careful attention to the rhythms of the natural world. Survival depended not on controlling those rhythms, but on understanding them well enough to respond when they shifted. The search for nourishment became an ongoing dialogue between people and the ecosystems around them, a dialogue that shaped both human behavior and human biology across the long arc of our shared history. When we step back and look across the long arc of human history, a quiet pattern begins to emerge. For most of the time our species has existed, food was not something that surrounded people constantly. It appeared in moments, in places, and in conditions that had to be discovered again and again. The human story unfolded within landscapes where nourishment moved through ecosystems according to the rhythms of rain, soil, sunlight, and animal movement. Human communities survived by learning to recognize these rhythms and by adjusting their lives around them. Yet even the most experienced communities could not predict every change within the natural world. Weather could shift suddenly, plants might grow later than expected, animals could follow new routes through the landscape. These changes did not always happen gradually. Sometimes they occurred quickly enough that people who had relied on a familiar place for food could arrive and discover that the expected resources had disappeared. In those moments, the balance between humans and the environment revealed its fragile nature. The strategies developed over generations helped communities respond to these disruptions, but they could never remove the possibility that food might become scarce again. This uncertainty shaped the way humans approached the landscape. People did not move through their environment assuming that nourishment would always be present. Instead, they observed carefully, remembering where certain foods had appeared before and watching for signs that conditions were changing. A particular flowering plant might signal the arrival of a season when other edible plants would soon emerge. The behavior of animals might suggest that larger migrations were approaching. Even subtle changes in the wind, the soil, or the sound of insects could provide clues about the shifting state of the environment. Over generations, these observations formed a kind of ecological awareness that helped guide the search for food. At the same time, this awareness was always accompanied by humility toward forces that remained beyond human control. Communities could read many signals within the landscape, but they could not command the rains or direct the movement of animals. The ecosystems that provided nourishment operated according to their own internal processes. Human survival depended on responding to those processes rather than reshaping them. This relationship required patience, flexibility, and cooperation among members of the community. When food was abundant, people gathered and shared it, restoring strength within the group. When food became scarce, the community adjusted its movement, its effort, and its expectations while searching for new opportunities. Over long periods of time, these patterns influenced the development of human culture. Knowledge about landscapes, plants, animals, and seasons became part of stories, traditions, and teaching within communities. Younger generations learned not only which foods were edible, but also how the environment behaved across time. They learned where rivers tended to flood, where animals crossed mountain passes, and where plants returned after seasonal rains. This transmission of ecological knowledge allowed human communities to remain connected to the landscapes that sustained them. Yet even the most detailed knowledge could not create certainty, and, quote, each generation still faced the possibility that familiar patterns might shift. In this sense, the human experience of food remained closely tied to the living world that surrounded it. Nourishment was never simply a collection of resources waiting to be gathered. It was the result of an ongoing relationship between people and ecosystems that were always changing. The body stored energy, the community shared food, and knowledge guided movement. But all of these responses existed within the larger dynamics of nature itself. When we consider this long history, the title of our question begins to feel less surprising. The world in which humans evolved was not a place where food waited reliably in every moment. It was a landscape where nourishment appeared through ecological processes that could shift from one season to the next. Within that environment, even experienced communities sometimes face moments when familiar sources of food disappeared faster than expected. These moments were not necessarily constant, but they were common enough to shape how humans lived, moved, and understood the natural world. In the modern world, it is easy to imagine food as something stable and constantly present. Markets are filled every day. Crops are grown in carefully managed fields. Food can travel across oceans and continents to reach places where it was never produced. Because of these systems, many people experience hunger as a delay between meals rather than as a sudden disappearance of nourishment. Yet when we look across the long span of human history, this stability is very recent. For most of the time our species has existed, the world operated according to very different rules. Food appeared through the shifting rhythms of ecosystems, and those rhythms could change without warning. Human communities survived in that world, not because food was always abundant, but because people developed ways to live within uncertainty. They moved across landscapes when resources shifted. They shared food when one member of the group succeeded. They watched the seasons carefully, remembering where plants grew and where animals passed through. And within their own bodies they carried small reserves of energy that allowed them to endure the quiet spaces between opportunities for nourishment. None of these responses eliminated hunger entirely. Instead, they created a system of resilience that allowed human life to continue even when the landscape became less generous for a time. When we imagine the deep past, it can be tempting to picture constant struggle or constant scarcity. The archaeological record does not support such a simple picture. There were moments of abundance when animals were plentiful and plants grew richly across the land. There were also quieter periods when the search for food required patience and careful movement. Human history unfolded between these two conditions. Communities experienced cycles in which the environment offered nourishment, and cycles in which the same landscape required more effort and attention to sustain life. What becomes clear when we observe this pattern is that the human relationship with food has always been dynamic. Plants and animals respond to rainfall, temperature, soil, and countless other forces that shape ecosystems. Human communities learn to read these changes and adapt their behavior, but they never fully controlled them. The search for nourishment therefore became part of a larger relationship with the natural world. Humans watched the land, listened to its signals, and moved within its rhythms while accepting that those rhythms might sometimes change. This perspective also reveals something important about the human body and mind. The capacity to store energy, the ability to cooperate in groups, and the curiosity to explore new landscapes were not accidental features of our species. They were shaped over many generations by the environments in which humans lived. Each adaptation helped people navigate a world where food could appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly. These traits allowed communities to survive moments when the balance between people and the environment briefly shifted. Today, much of humanity lives within food systems that reduce this uncertainty. Agriculture, storage technologies, and global trade networks allow societies to buffer themselves from many environmental fluctuations. Crops can be stored for long periods, and food can be transported across great distances when local supplies decline. These systems have changed the daily experience of hunger for many people. Yet the deeper story of human evolution reminds us that the foundations of our species were shaped in a different context, one in which food was never completely guaranteed. When we ask why so much of human history could face sudden hunger, the answer does not lie in a single cause. It emerges from the interaction of many elements. landscapes that changed with climate, ecosystems where plants and animals followed seasonal patterns, communities that moved to follow those resources, and bodies that carried temporary reserves of energy while the search continued. Together, these elements formed a fragile but resilient system that allowed humans to inhabit a wide variety of environments across the planet. Seen in this light, the long history of human nourishment becomes less a story about scarcity and more a story about adaptation. Humans did not evolve in a world of constant abundance, nor in a world of constant famine. Instead, they lived in landscapes where opportunity and uncertainty existed side by side. The ability to notice change, cooperate with others, and respond to shifting conditions became essential skills for survival. Over many generations, these skills shaped the way human communities interacted with the environment that sustained them. And perhaps this long history invites one final reflection. The systems that provide food today may feel stable, yet they still depend on the same ecosystems that supported human life in the past. Rain still falls, plants still grow, animals still move through landscapes according to patterns that began long before modern societies appeared. In that sense, the ancient dialogue between humans and the natural world has never fully ended. It has simply taken new forms. If the environments that shaped human evolution were worlds where food could appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly, what quiet lessons from that long history might still remain hidden within the way our species lives today?